Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. The bell tinkled, the glass door was pushed inwards of Annabel's, the old world antique shop. An elderly woman with white curly hair burst through the door, along with a blustering gust of unwelcome, stinging, icy Arctic air that entered with her, causing the cool temperature of the shop to plummet considerably. I was working behind the counter at the time, polishing up a pair of sizable, highly ornate silver teapots that had belonged to one of Ireland's most prominent aristocratic families, whose grandiose, vast residence had been taken over by the government in World War II to transform the sprawling residence into a hospital, as the demand for hospital beds was rife at the time. My father's antique shop had acquired some of the family's highly esteemed heirlooms, these silver rococo teapots being among some of them, for they had entertained, for lavish high teas, the likes of George Bernard Shaw, Yeats and Lady Gregory, Ireland's greatest woman. So there would be many eager buyers, more than a little enthusiastic, to own such an invaluable possession. I began vigorously rubbing away years of tarnished metal that was so black that this was no easy job. But slowly and surely the blackness began to recede, bringing out the gleaming silver that lay buried beneath. Annabel's was a special shop, vastly different from your average antique shop, for my father, who opened the shop in the early 1970s, was an intrepid explorer who travelled the entire globe to bring back interesting items from all over the world, some with a fascinating story or history behind them. Things like an unusual embellished mirror that was sometimes mist, clouding all on its own, as if the reflective glass had become like moonstone. It would do this throughout the day for seconds at a time, for no apparent reason at all, leaving many of our startled customers completely flummoxed. "How can it do that?" they would exclaim in awe. Annabel's contained some spectacular antiques. There was an interesting chair, ostentatiously carved, that had belonged to some African king. A mounted monkey's head that was acclaimed to bring you great luck if you dared to stroke it. A cannibal's necklace of human teeth. An old army uniform from the Second World War. An original picture of a ghostly apparition taken in some famous obscure Scottish castle walking down a sweeping ornate staircase. An antique leather-bound book of ancient legends. A Chippendale antique desk. A snuff-box from the time of Billy the Kid. A silver inkwell once owned by Beatrix Potter. A very unusual French antique doll. Eclectic tortoise-shell sunglasses that were acclaimed to have once belonged to Marilyn Monroe. All kinds of stuff like that, along of course with your usual less colourful items that you would invariably find in other antique shops as well. Yet it was my father's passion to buy items of history with a story behind them, for people love purchasing the unusual and bizarre. But an item with a story always quadrupled its value on every conceivable level, for it would seem people loved stories of any kind, as indeed did I, especially stories so outlandish and incredulous they seemed almost impossible to believe. I looked up as the old woman began to approach me cautiously, with the reluctant stealth of a leopard, along with an air of indifference that gave me the distinct impression She would rather be anywhere else in the entire world than in this charming idiosyncratic antique shop, where you could find all kinds of unusual spectacular gifts, from the eclectic, vintage, to the avant-garde, and even the futuristic. Indeed, we had it all, to appeal to every imagination, every taste, every style. After all, one man's junk may just indeed be another man's treasure. I could see she was limping as she shuffled along awkwardly on her walking stick, in a very flat pair of navy blue court shoes, her willowy ailing body clearly taking strain under her enfeebled lumbering efforts to reach the desk, rather like a half-uprooted gnarled tree battling against the precarious current of a feisty wind. She was fragile, about 4 foot tall, with a skin so fine it was almost translucent. I could see her frenzied pale blue eyes darting around the shop like a ferret, as if she was looking for something of great significance. She looked like a woman deeply troubled, discomposed if you like, as if something had truly ruffled her feathers. "Need any help?" I asked the prostrate woman, giving her a warm, encouraging smile. I knew better than to pounce on people when they entered the shop, as most people preferred to be left to themselves, to meander around, whilst marvelling in all the items on display. She did not respond to my smile. Her face was fixed, her intent purposeful, her gait determined. "I'm looking for a ring," she said. "A blue sapphire, to be exact." "Well, let's see if I can be of any help," I said, reaching into a glass cabinet in front of me, drawing out onto the glass counter a vast selection of antique rings to show her. "What did you have in mind? I've got several sapphire rings, as it happens, right here. Some of them are really quite beautiful. Now this one here is terribly, terribly pretty. I have been told it's about 200 years old. It's rumoured that this beguiling, exquisite piece may have been worn by Grace Kelly, but I'd like to specify it's only a rumour." The woman wilfully ignored my words. While her attentive eyes were industriously engaged, they travelled down the long column of rings that were so elegantly displayed against the dark velvety cushioned upholstered padding of the ring box. It was like her eyes were examining every single ring in detail, as if her life quite literally depended on it. "It's not here," she said finally, her frightened brown eyes registering alarm. She looked up at me with an expression of grave concern, her hands trembling, her jaw tightening, while her frail, unstable body visibly stiffened. For a second she looked like a white mannequin. "Sorry," I said. "What's not here? I'm not following you, ma'am." "Let me explain better. My daughter, well, she sold you some pieces of my old jewellery. I decided to sell them off. It made a lot of sense to me. You see, I'm moving into a retirement home shortly. I've been downsizing my life, so to speak. Well, she wasn't supposed to sell that ring. She wasn't supposed to sell it. I did warn her about it. But she sold it. I can't believe she sold it to you." "Oh, I see," I said, my eyes softening. "The ring is sentimental to you, is it? I think I can understand that. It's very hard to let go of stuff you really love, let alone replace it. Some things are irreplaceable. It must have been an oversight on her part. I'm quite sure she didn't intentionally mean to sell it behind your back like that." "You don't understand! You don't understand!" said the woman, grabbing my arm, taking me by surprise as she squeezed it ever so tightly with an urgent pressure that was impressive for one so frail. Her pale blue eyes bored into mine with the intensity of a jackhammer that was so profound. "You don't understand! You don't understand! That sapphire, it isn't an ordinary sapphire. There is something wrong with that ring. It is dangerous, very, very dangerous," she announced. "It's cursed. If the person buys that ring and wears it, they will almost certainly die. They will almost certainly die. Do you understand what I'm saying? They will die." At that, my mouth dropped open like a Venus flytrap in surprise. This was an appalling revelation, one that I had not expected. A cold chill jolted down my spine in a series of electric spasms, as her ominous words hung in the atmosphere like a bad, noxious smell that could not be abated. Even my heart rate had increased in intensity, as I hardly wanted to be responsible for selling someone a cursed item. You would think that a woman's outlandish, nonsensical, emotional display would have left me believing she was unhinged or as nutty as a fruitcake. But I assure you, working with antiques as I have done so for many years, this was most certainly not the case. I have seen strange things over the years, very, very strange things. For indeed, phantasmic items have crossed my path with eerie supernatural tales behind them that are so bizarre they would make your hair curl. It's not something I've ever willingly talked about in an open forum, as there are some insider secrets in the antiques business that you prefer not to discuss with locals, such as haunted, jinxed, unearthly or cursed objects being among many of those discussions. So this was not the first time I'd heard of a cursed item, nor would it be the last. I had enough quintessential experience behind me to know that the woman's outrageous claims may not be as preposterous or as far-fetched as they initially seemed. "I suppose you're going to think I'm silly, a silly batty old woman," she said, with my head in the clouds, but I assure you I'm not. I need that ring back. I need it back desperately. If someone wears that ring, it will likely kill them. I'm not exaggerating about this, believe me, I know. Now, it's a pretty oval sapphire. It's surrounded by a cluster of white diamonds. Do you recall selling it at all? As it happens, I do. I know the one. It was a very beautiful ring. We sold it about 2 weeks ago. I can check the records if you like, to find out who bought it. That would be so good, very good, said the old lady, looking heartily relieved, as if my words brought her a great measure of reassurance. You sit down, I said, pulling out an upholstered chair for the woman. You look as white as a ghost. The colour has completely drained from your face. The old woman sank back gratefully onto the cushioned chair, luxuriating, wallowing in its comfort, so relieved to finally be getting the weight off her weak legs. I'm going to make you a nice hot cup of tea, I told her. Then you can tell me all about this mysterious ring of yours, and its connection to a curse, of course. I could tell the woman's energy had been drained from her. She looked fatigued. She needed some sweet tea, and fast, I thought. Oh, would you, dear? I'm half parched. It's freezing cold out there. My word, the weather is terrible. My whole body is shaking like a leaf. I'm not used to shopping around town these days, especially in wintry conditions like this. My body's not as agile as it used to be. I do get terribly tired. Of course you do, I said. It's perfectly understandable. Before long, the woman was sitting opposite the counter, drinking a cup of piping hot sweet tea. Her arthritic fingers wobbled precariously, jiggling the bone china cup and saucer in her hands. For a moment, I seriously thought she was going to drop the hot tea all over herself. Oh, that is so good, dear, she sighed. You do make an excellent cup of tea. Now for the record, I told the old lady. If it's any consolation to you, I do not think you're batty. On the contrary, the reverse is true. If you look around this antique shop of my father's, there's a plethora of items in here that have belonged to people long since deceased. Every physical object can carry an energy signature or imprint of a person on it. I know that now to be profoundly true. On occasion, there can be a paranormal attachment to something. I've witnessed this myself firsthand. Sometimes we've even had ghostly activity here in the shop, usually occurring soon after we purchase an item to sell. So I'm well acquainted with the abnormal, should we say. What kind of ghostly activity are you talking about? Asked the woman, her curiosity now aroused. Oh, I could tell you many stories, I said, taking a large sip of tea and replacing the cup onto the counter. I mean, I've been eyewitness to queer stuff going on in here, like the electrics going ballistic, or the shop becoming as cold as ice, almost as if a Siberian sub-zero temperatures have suddenly entered the shop on their own accord. There are times I've sensed I'm not alone, that I'm being watched, but nobody's ever there. I always go and check, but nobody is. Then there are other times I've heard distinct chattering voices, conversations so obscure that you can't even hear what someone is saying, but it sounds as though they're in the shop only yards away from you. And when I move towards the chatter, it just suddenly stops, almost as if they're aware of my presence, whoever they are. It's easy to think you're going daft, or your imagination is in overdrive, but that is not the case. There are times I've been physically touched as well, where I can feel a cold hand brushing against my face. That creeps me out a lot. So you could say I've had some outlandish experiences here at Annabelle's that, shall we say, are more than a little bizarre. I'll give you an example of a very strange experience I had here in the shop. There was a young man here in his 30s, a handsome-looking man, actually, very easy on the eyes, wearing 1900 clothes. He stood here larger than life before me. He was as real as you and me, so I never had reason to doubt his physicality, although on reflection he was decidedly pale. I never saw or heard him enter the premises, as the bell would normally tinkle to alert me to a customer. On this occasion I never heard it. He was a very distinctive gentleman. He was wearing a distinguished-looking, superbly tailored navy blue short-fronted tailcoat, along with a matching fitted waistcoat, which he wore over a white linen shirt, with a matching white linen neckcloth, a pair of tight-fitting caramel-coloured pantaloons, and a pair of knee-high dark brown Hessian boots, lined with a caramel leather trim. He looked very debonair, striking. He was wearing a tall beaver hat. He looked incredibly elegant, cultured, self-assured. I remember thinking he must be taking a part in some kind of reenactment of the 1800s, or 1900s rather, from the Historic Society, as they're situated a block away from Main Street. I've often seen them there, dressing up in fancy historic regalia to celebrate various events in our illustrious American history. In truth, I thought he was a superb actor, a brilliant one at that, who was having a bit of fun at my expense, giving I work in an antique shop of all things, surrounded by a tsunami of ancient relics. It made sense that he was having fun with me, I thought. I said to him teasingly, "Sir, you look the picture of sartorial elegance in your ensemble. I'm most impressed." I remember he looked at me with such a befuddled expression on his face. He responded to me in a crisp, pompous voice, with a level of elocution in his language far superior to ours. It was clear he was from American aristocracy. He said to me, "Young lady, I'm not here to receive the extravagance of your social niceties, as well-meaning as they may be. For indeed it is a man's honour to impress upon a woman a compliment in her manner of dress, rather than receive one for himself, to excite his own vanities. No, I'm not here to discuss such meaningless trivia with you. But in regards to a matter that holds my attention with a very grave concern, I want your resolute, tenacious assurance that you won't sell the golden pocket watch from Woolton Watch Company, which I have left so generously in your charge, under the auspicious umbrella of your vigilant protection, for it is indeed a priceless possession of which I hold in the greatest regard." "He said that to you? That's a mouthful." "Yes, he said that to me. Then he turned around and walked away, just like that. I don't even think I heard the tinkle of the bell as the door opened out into the street. The man was gone from the shop that quickly. I must admit I just shook my head, chuckled to myself, and actually thought if I were a film producer, I would almost certainly hire him on the spot for his remarkable interpretation of a 1900s gentleman. I thought it was all just an act. He was acting out his character, although I will admit I was rather bewildered that he knew about the Woolton Watch Company for a start, and the pocket watch, as it had only just come into our possession. I gave the matter no further thought or attention until 2 days later, that is, when I sold the watch to a very eager client. I wrapped it up in a magnificent box, which I covered in fancy paper, with a pretty bow, along with the name of our shop on a sticker. I then placed the package in a pink cardboard box, with the name Annabelle's on it. The man was absolutely thrilled. It was his father's 70th birthday. He couldn't wait to buy him something extra special to celebrate the grand, illustrious occasion. He thought the watch he was buying from us was the quintessential perfect gift, perceiving that his father would be tickled pink, as he had a sizable collection of 1900 pocket watches already, so this pocket watch would be a great piece to add to the collection. Suffice to say, the customer came back to my shop in a dreadful, appalling state, claiming his father had opened the present in front of him, and the box was empty. As you can imagine, he'd seen me wrap up the present himself, so his feathers were well and truly ruffled. He couldn't understand what was going on. The pocket watch had literally vanished into thin air. It was like something you'd expect to see in a Vegas magic show. I pulled out our collection of pocket watches, and sure enough it was placed back there in the glass cabinet, here in our shop. How did it leave the confines of a wrapped present, returning just to be in our cabinet all over again? It was very strange. I remember wrapping it up again, putting it in the box myself, repackaging it, and handing it back to the grateful customer, who took it home to give to his dad. But when his father opened the box, once again it had vanished. Of course I was to discover it had been safely returned to our glass cabinet over there. It's been sitting there for over 10 years, and it hasn't been short of admirers and people wanting to buy it. but I never let them buy it because I know what will happen. It'll just return to the shop. It's one of those objects that simply refuses to be sold. It's desirous to stay here, come hell or high water. I was to find out later from the Historic Society down the road that there was no man fitting that description on that day that was dressed up to the nines like that. So I'm forced to conclude that I had a conversation with a ghost. A ghost, it would seem, who's very particular over the safe keeping of his pocket watch. It's the weirdest, most enigmatic thing, to be so comfortably well acquainted with seriously weird stuff. So nothing you can tell me will surprise me or destabilise my lack of scepticism, for I've seen it all, believe me. So now, after my absurd revelation, I hope you'll be inspired to tell me yours, why you're so convinced that this sapphire ring is indeed cursed. The woman stammered awkwardly. Well, how do I begin? It belonged to my grandmother, actually. It was her engagement ring from my grandfather. She always loved sapphires. Anyway, shortly after they got married, they went to Africa for their honeymoon. It was a form of celebration. They loved Africa. My grandmother visited this remote African village out in the middle of nowhere. This was not your average African village. The people just stared at her because she was so white. They'd never seen a white person like her before a day in their lives, especially one so fair. The children ran up to my grandmother, touching her skin in reverent awe, unable to believe how light it was. They were talking to each other excitedly, exuberantly, regarding my grandmother as if she was some kind of a goddess. My grandmother asked the translator that was with them what the kids were saying about her. I gather they thought that she came from the stars, you know, like the Palladians or something. My grandmother and her husband were promptly bustled into this huge grass-rounded hut, which had an earthen floor. They were informed that the medicine man, or witch doctor if you like, wanted to see them. My grandmother was a fine woman of God, very intuitive. When she met the witch doctor, she felt chills going down her spine. Something about the man set her nerves on edge. She said she was certain he had a demonical energy about him. The witch doctor's attention was focused on my grandmother's ring. He asked if he might look at it, so she held out her hand before him. The man held her hand in his, studying the ring ever so intently with a fixed, glazed look. My grandmother said she watched the man's eyes rolling in his head until they were totally white. He then blew on the stone from his mouth. To her horror, she physically discerned this purple smoke spiralling out of his mouth like the smoke from a chimney. It then whirled into the stone, promptly vanishing. My grandmother was so shocked she thought she must have imagined things, but my grandfather had witnessed it too. This was an anomalous event they couldn't understand. They asked the witch doctor what the smoke was for that he had blown into the ring, as, of course, they were more than a little perturbed. He assured them it was some kind of an ancient African blessing from the ancestors. Within a day after this event, my grandmother experienced the most horrendous shooting pains all over her body. After a doctor's visit, she was diagnosed with full-blown terminal cancer, given only a month to live. It was a devastating shock to my grandparents. They were in their early 20s at the time, with their whole lives ahead of them. It felt as if the rug had been pulled from beneath their feet. My grandmother suddenly remembered the strange purple smoke being blown into her ring by that witch doctor. She guessed it was nefarious, so she decided to stop wearing the ring, to see if her health improved. It did. It was very peculiar, because after she stopped wearing the ring, her skin went purple for a couple of days, the identical colour of the purple smoke that the witch doctor had blown into her ring. I gather the pain left her body almost immediately, and after a visit to the doctor's office, it was discovered she was cancer-free. My grandmother told her very sceptical, dubious sister what had happened. Her sister pooh-poohed the whole idea, insisted on wearing the ring for a few days to prove a point, and then she too ended up with full-blown cancer, which immediately vanished once she stopped wearing the ring. So now you know why I'm concerned about anyone who may be wearing that ring. If they continue to wear it, they will almost certainly die. I'm in no doubt about that. Worse still, they wouldn't know the ring is connected to their physical decline. It's that purple smoke that's locked in the sapphire. That's what kills the person. It's an extraordinary story, Mrs. Winthrop. Mrs. Winthrop, I repeated. I told you I'm not cynical. I believe every word of what you've told me. But you're right. Time is of the essence. I immediately went towards my filing cabinet, rushing through the invoices as quickly as I possibly could. "Oh, here it is," I said, sighing with relief. "Sapphire ring, purchased by a man called Devon Undergrove. Leave it to me, I told the old woman. I'll go and see Devon myself. I'll speak to him about the ring. Tell him about the acclaimed curse. I will tell him your entire story. Then it's up to him what he does about it. You will? Oh, that is so kind of you, said the old lady. You don't know what you've done. You've taken a weight off my mind. I'm not getting any younger these days. Coming here has taken the wind out of my sails. So knowing that you're going to take care of things, it's a monumental relief for me. I can't thank you enough. And so there I was, driving my truck to a custom-made farmhouse in the Willamette Valley, which is in the heart of wine country, approximately an hour and 20 minutes drive from my home in Portland, Oregon. I was visiting a peppermint farm of all things. I'd phoned the gentleman to tell him that I needed to see him urgently about a delicate matter concerning the sapphire ring he had purchased as a gift for his mother. I assured him that I needed to see him in person, as discussing this incongruous story over the phone was not right in my opinion, given the delicacy of the matter. Before long I found myself driving down a long asphalt driveway, surrounded by rolling verdant fields of peppermint crop, along with undulating grassland, like an ocean, rising and falling in billowing ripples. Several American quarter horses were happily frolicking in the fields, their long full tails of dark hair twitching under the pretty ethereal light of the early morning sun that was now breaking through the cobalt sky with a generous steely determination. Their dish-like heads lifted up as my truck neared its approach, their interest in me very brief. I passed a huge red barn that was so large it was suitable for a wedding venue, as well as a couple of gleaming silvery ponds, surrounded by a scattering of weeping willows that sparkled under the twinkling light, their long curvaceous arms bejewelled in emerald leaves that cascaded in long flowing voluptuous drapes above the reflectant glistening water. While propagated generously across the sprawling viridescent wilderness were ubiquitous clusters of medium-sized trees, namely Douglas firs, cottonwoods, ponderosa pines, all gathered together in tight congenial groups. In 2 shakes I found myself drawing up to a custom-made home that shimmered prettily in the first light of the new morning, casting its fragrant shadows across the wraparound porch. It was certainly an attractive house, painted in a grey-blue colour, matching the sky, complemented by a grey slate roof, while the white wooden bay windows were enormous. A young man, cleanly shaven in his early 30s with a boyish face, square jawline, along with bright hazel eyes, came ambling out of the house as quickly as he could, running towards the door of my truck, which he opened for me speedily. "Oh, there you are! I've been expecting you. Sorry, what is your name?" he said, flushing an awkward shade of pink. "I didn't get it. You are—" I stretched out my hand to shake his. Sorry, the name is Poppy Kensett." "Pleased to meet you, Poppy. I'm not going to kid, you've got me very intrigued. What was it you said? A matter of extreme importance concerning the sapphire ring I bought for my mother. Something that you reiterated must not under any circumstances be discussed over the phone. Since you called, I've been champing at the bit to get to the bottom of this enigmatic, curious mystery. I love mysteries. You're not here to tell me it was owned by Elizabeth Taylor, are you?" he teased, while the corners of his lips twitched into a smile that he was fighting to suppress. "Nothing of the sort," I said. "I'd rather not discuss it here, though. Can we go inside somewhere?" "My thoughts exactly. Have you had breakfast?" "No, I haven't, as it happens." "Good, very good. I've taken the initiative of asking the housekeeper to pack us a picnic breakfast with croissants, orange juice and a thermos of hot coffee. I hope you like croissants. I thought we could take our little picnic in the back of my ATV, where we can eat in the woods somewhere. I do enjoy eating al fresco. It makes things taste so good." "You're on," I said. "I love croissants. All that butter melting in your mouth. It doesn't get better than that, does it? I'm salivating just thinking about it already." "Good, let's go," he said in a gravelly voice. "Are you married, Miss Poppy?" "No, I'm not." "The day's getting infinitely brighter. An unexpected serendipitous date in the woods with a very attractive woman, if I may say. I'm very fortunate indeed. Come this way." I flushed at his unexpected flattery, my skin burning a bright red, following him to his ATV vehicle. Before long we were driving through the countryside, up and down the precipitous hilly slopes, through the wooded sanctuary, where he finally parked the ATV outside a large Douglas fir tree, where we found the perfect place to picnic on the electric green forest floor. I carefully spread out the picnic blanket, flattening it out with my hands over the rambling undergrowth, while Devon opened the basket and proceeded to pull out a delectable spread that was ever so extravagant. If that wasn't enough, he opened a bottle of champagne to add some glamour to the occasion. There was smoked salmon and cream cheese bagels, warm almond croissants filled with melted butter, fresh strawberries, warm little mini cheese and bacon quiches, and strawberry shortbread slices. Wow, this is certainly some spread. Do you do this for all your dates? Because if so, I am very impressed. Any girl turning down a date with you needs her head examining. I mean, I would date you just for a slice of this delicious strawberry shortbread. Well, I'd like to think that it's not just the shortbread that is so beguiling. I've been told I've got nice eyes. I giggled. You should know better. A fish does not bite at the bait if it knows it's there. What's that supposed to mean? Don't fish for compliments. I appraise people's antiques, not the colour of their eyes. Oh, on the subject of antiques, how's your mother doing? That's a very strange question for you to ask. My mother may be old, but I would hardly call her an antique. You don't even know her. Why this incongruous interest in her health? If you must know, she's not doing very well. He said this, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness. You know, he said, almost choking on his words, as he took a big bite of almond croissant, wiping away the crumbs from his lips. My mother is a very remarkable woman, the life and soul of every party. She's been as fit as a fiddle all her life. We thought she'd outlive us all, but it would seem shortly after her 80th birthday her health took a dreadful nosedive. We've been told she has a rampant aggressive cancer. Only months left to live, maybe weeks or even days. You can never be sure with these things. They affect everyone so differently. I'm sorry. You say she got sick after her 80th birthday. Did you by any chance give her the sapphire ring as a present? I did, as it happens. She was over the moon. She wears that ring so proudly every day of her life. Oh dear, that's terrible. How so? He said, raising a quizzical brow. Well, it's come to my attention that ring is cursed. That's why I've come here to tell you about it. At this, Devon burst out laughing. Cursed? I don't believe in stuff like that. Well, it's true, I exclaimed. I proceeded to tell him the story about the old lady's trip to Africa and that strange witch doctor that had blown a purple smoke into the ring. Devon's face darkened. It all makes sense, he said suddenly. My mother began to get sick after she started wearing that ring. It adds up. She needs to get that ring off her finger right now, even as I speak. He pulled out his cell phone out of his pocket and began to dial her number. It's ringing, he said, champing at the bit. Mum, please answer. Answer now. Hurry up. Get to the phone. Hello, Devon. This is a surprise, phoning me so early in the morning, came a flat female voice, accompanied by a few desperate breaths that sounded like a woman drowning in her own lungs, as she was clearly struggling to breathe. Mum, don't ask any questions, but do as I say. Get the sapphire ring off your finger now, the one that I gave you. Why, son? It's so pretty. I don't want to take it off. Because, Mum, it's cursed. The ring is slowly killing you. Take it off now. I'll explain later, but you must remove it. For a while, Devon seemed lost in his thoughts. Thanks for coming, Poppy. But I think we should both call it a day under the circumstances. I need to get back to my mother to make sure she's taken that ring off her fingers. She can't be trusted at times. You don't think it's too late for her, he asked, past the point of no return? I do hope not, I said. I'm not sure what to expect with a curse, but I do know that the two women that stopped wearing the ring fully recovered. But then again, they were a lot younger than your mother. Their bodies might have been more resilient. Your mother, well, she's a lot older, isn't she? It could be a different ball game for her. As we were pondering over these sobering thoughts, the forest suddenly seemed to shake. I was not a country girl, but I sensed immediately that something was terribly wrong. It was like the ground heaved and groaned under a mini-earthquake. What's that? I asked Devon, but he didn't answer. For a moment he stood there like a statue, staring blankly into the forest, almost as if transfixed by something. He then put his finger on his lips to indicate for me to remain very quiet. The rumbling sound continued. It sounded like the ground was thumping under the weight of a hefty herd of bison. Something's coming, I squeaked. Something's coming. Let's get out of here now. In that moment I could feel the terror passing through my veins like a steam train on full throttle, refusing to stop. Devon remained still, unresponsive to my words, while the thundering noise loomed ever closer. The ground was now crashing under a heavy footfall. Then we saw her, standing before us, towering at 8 foot tall. It was a Bigfoot, a female Bigfoot. My mouth dropped open in astonishment, my eyes growing as wide as saucers, while my whole body trembled in terror. For I knew I was standing yards away from an apex predator. I could hardly dare to believe it. I had seen the remarkable footage of the Bigfoot taken in Bluff Creek, but this creature was exceedingly different. For a start, she was lankier, leaner, more muscular, her breasts small and pert, her hair the colour of a raven's feathers, gleaming with a vibrant, robust health that carpeted her body in a luxurious coat of long flowing hair, which was less thick under the armpits and on the knee area. The thing that took me off guard, jolting my surprise out of its comfort zone in a blinding revelatory light, was the human face of the creature. Granted, it was set in a pyramid-shaped head, possessing a short neck, but with the exception of those key discrepancies, the creature was almost entirely human, only her build was on a much larger, more impressive scale than that of ours. So yes, she was exceedingly intimidating. The creature was startled to see us, very startled. She hadn't expected to be caught out like this, but I visibly relaxed when I saw her eyes. They were kind, warm, congenial, so I knew she meant us no harm, despite her intimidating facade. I could see that she was a gentle creature. Devon was trembling, but not with fear, with wondrous excitement and awe. He pointed towards our picnic basket. "Over there," he said to the creature. "Help yourself." The creature seemed to understand his generous overtures. Needing little encouragement, she glided over to the picnic basket, lifting out the champagne bottle, taking a large swig in her mouth, swallowing a glug of the fizzy alcohol, shaking her head in disgust, as if to say, "Boy, that's revolting." But just to make absolutely sure her first impressions were accurate, she then took another swig, shaking her head again in disgust. At that, Devon and I burst out laughing. The creature sensed she had an amused audience. I think she liked it. She decided she enjoyed the attention, and receiving all this attention wasn't so bad after all. And she was possibly a teensy-weensy bit enjoying the whole thing. So she finally took a swig of the champagne again, but this time put on an exaggerated expression about her level of disgust in regards to the fizzy liquid, which had us both roaring with laughter. I discerned a very pleased twinkle in her eye. We continued to watch her as she ruffled through the picnic basket with an enthusiastic fervour. No prizes for guessing what she pulled out of the basket first. The strawberry shortbread. Of course, what else would it be? We watched as she took a bite. The orgasmic expression of ecstasy on her face was so heightened it would have made a sailor blush. The creature knew how to savour every single mouthful, eating it slowly, deliberately, chewing it thoroughly, wallowing in the crisp texture and rich sweetness. We watched her for easily over 20 minutes, devouring all that delicious strawberry shortbread, until there was absolutely nothing left behind but a few crumbs. She appeared unfazed, undaunted, and unoffended by our presence. Once she'd finished the shortbread, she nodded briefly at us, lifted the basket and the champagne bottle as well, which really was rather strange given she couldn't stand the taste of it, and then she disappeared into the woods. She moved away from us, almost floating as she did. "What's wrong?" I said, looking at Devon's hazel eyes, misting over with clouds of tears. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" said Devon. "I've lived in the Wilmite Valley all my life, and then after meeting you today, I asked the universe for a prominent sign that my mother would make a swift recovery. And we so happened to chance upon the most easy, chilled, laid-back Bigfoot. I mean, what's the chance of that happening? My mother is now going to make a full recovery. I just know it. The Bigfoot is a clear sign to me." And she did. Days after removing the ring from her finger, her skin took on a purple hue. Then it all faded. Her energy returned. The cancer vanished. Sometimes life can be serendipitous, for if it had not been for that cursed ring, I would never have met my future husband, as Devon and I are now very happily married. The chances of us ever crossing paths were incredibly remote. So there definitely is an intrinsic plan behind everything. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners,
in a quiet, subdued, charming, prepossessing country town in North Carolina, nestled in the heart of a beguiling pretty valley, set up against the twirling shapes of the mountains that rise up in the sky in an ocean of soft undulating waves, was a very cosy, close-knit community of like-minded convivial people, a charming, endearing, welcoming southern hospitality that would warm up the cockles of the coldest heart. It would seem that at first glance, when enjoying the wondrous spectacular views over our town, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that the pretty curvaceous faint blue and purple smudges painted on the horizon, the quintessential landmarks I knew so well, had been applied with the skilled tweak of an artist's brush, for they were so subtle, the soft contours only adding to the lure of this transfixing space. The charming, whimsical town was where I was raised by two very loving parents, the magical place that I was privileged to call home. Indeed, if that wasn't enough eye candy for you, adding to the scenic magnificence, rather like the exotic spices to a delicious Christmas cake, were the viridescent spectacular greens of the woodgroves that swathed the countryside in a kaleidoscope of bushy, tall, medium-sized trees that were clustered in ubiquitous congenial groups, from cypress, sweet gums, hickories, pines, red maples, and oaks. The species of trees as varied, unique, and resplendent as the landscape itself, that was decadently teeming with an abundance of indigenous wildlife, along with some well-marked hiking and horse-riding trails that were frequently used by the locals and regular overseas visitors to our neck of the woods. Yet in this beautiful, unassuming, safe country town, a predator was at bay, lurking in the dark shadows with the stealth and cunning of a leopard, his slight figure normally cloaked in a hoodie, so that his buried, well-concealed face was literally lost in a sea of black material, ensuring that his identity would be as vague, indeterminate, obscure, and blurred as the clothes themselves. He would slip into the dark shadows like a ghost in the night, disappearing from sight, lost off the radar like a ship at sea. Forget the Scarlet Pimpernel. This man was elusive, like a leopard, as slippery as butter, as hard to catch as a feral cat. The mysterious, featureless stranger was described as wearing an unremarkable pair of black jeans, a mediocre bomber jacket, a very run-of-the-mill standard pair of combat boots, which left you none the wiser as to who he could be, for indeed he could be anyone at all, who would fit such an abstract, nondescript, prosaic, faceless, rather beige description. To all intensive purposes, the sagacious, sharp-witted man of the night was as shrewd as he was savvy, perspicacious, calculating, insightfully aware of his surroundings. Every movement, every change of the light, every smell in the air, he knew it all, as if he had become one with the shadows, sinking disingenuously into their murky depths. But who was he? That was the question that lingered on everyone's minds, haunting their darkest nightmares, waking them up prematurely in the night, when a banging sound of a lone tree branch knocked against a window. In all likelihood, nerves were heightened, tension pronounced, energy depleted, drained, for no one was without concerns about the whispering wanderings of the night, for all were exceedingly sensitized to their awareness of the predator now in our midst. Indeed, it was true, people in our small town were troubled, very troubled, about this indeterminate, astucious stranger that was prowling our streets at the dead of night, with nefarious, duplicitous, iniquitous intent, a judicious voucher that was neither discerning nor discriminating in regards to his quarry. Outwardly it would appear that this stranger was fascinated by women of every age, culture, body type, so a woman in her 80s was equally as vulnerable as a young lady in her 20s, possibly even more so. But what did he want? What was his agenda? What was he doing in our small town? By all accounts, all these questions were flying in the air like the confetti from a confetti canyon, skyrocketing into the clouds, but answers to this enigmatic question were certainly not forthcoming. It was in the summer of 1964. I was 22 years old at the time. People in our little town were becoming increasingly on edge, ever wary of the scheming, duplicitous, ingenious, evasive and slippery predator. Verily, sightings of him loitering around like an offensive, hideously disgusting bad smell were most certainly on the increase, becoming uncomfortably too common. What would he do next was the concern among many. It would seem that hearts increased their beats, minds lost their sense of calm. Fear dangled in the doorways of people's homes like a menacing spiderweb that no one appreciated. Reputably, people's front doors that were once so generously left open were fastidiously locked. Windows were latched, fastened, bolted. The easygoing, convivial, fun-loving ambience of the town had faded away like a bird on the wind, for a tension hung in the air with an atmosphere so heavy you could have cut it with a knife. I was soon to learn that the mysterious hooded man had only recently been spotted, furtively looking into the windows of two vulnerable elderly women, who lived on their own in whimsical, enchanting cottages not too far away from each other. If that wasn't sordid enough, these poor old ladies had woken up in the middle of the night to find a creeping, tall, shadowy figure staring at them, looming over them, watching them as they slept, as if getting some kind of a rush from giving them the fright of their lives. As the late Sheriff Hugh Ingleford would always say, "There are many unhinged people in this world whose motives and actions may be as mysterious and unexplainable as the Bermuda Triangle." This, he believed, was one of those cases, something unfathomable, nonsensical, that left you with more questions than answers. The two old women's accounts of the incident in question were almost like carbon copies of each other. They had been sleeping, sensed a presence, felt as if someone was watching them, looked up from their beds to see these beady eyes hovering over them like a bird of prey from only feet away. They had screamed in terror. The man had vanished. Putatively, despite intensive interviews with the sheriff, all that was revealed about him was no more enlightening. The hooded figure was dressed in black, his face obscure, his dark eyes beady. That certainly didn't give the police much to go on, because, put simply, he could be anyone or anywhere. I was working for the sheriff at the time, on and off as a police artist, where I was expected to draw up pictures of suspects from people who had randomly encountered someone of interest that could be a potential suspect in a police investigation. I had subsequently been called around to the sheriff's office to draw up a close picture of the mysterious hooded man, whom had been witnessed close up and personal. So at long last we were closing in on the mysterious stranger. Maybe now we might get some much-needed answers, as a close-up visual description of the man is what everyone had been praying for. As the story goes, the young man, on returning home from the local bar on foot, had stopped dead in his tracks when he'd seen a dark figure peering in the windows of his younger sister's bedroom, which was somehow overshadowed by the imposing presence of a Bradford pear tree. It was at about 6 o'clock at night, but with the outside light of the house still on, along with the bright luminescent full moon, along with the sparkling clusters of silvery stars, the visibility that night was excellent. In his eyes there was no mistaking what he'd seen. He realised at once that this was the town's elusive Peeping Tom that had brought a rural town crumbling to its knees. "Oi!" he called out. "Oi! You here! Get here!" The man glanced up and on seeing the witness began to run away, with the witness in hot pursuit of him. "Oi! Stop! Stop!" Fortunately, he did manage to throw the man onto the ground, succeeding in holding him down hard with a strong, forceful grip, eagerly tugging down his hoodie to see if he recognised the stranger's face. Regretfully, he did not. In a trice, after a big blow to the guts, with a very forceful, pounding, backbiting punch from the hooded stranger, the witness had been momentarily disabled, whilst the young man had risen off the ground with a buoyant jump and made his illustrious escape. Needless to say, this new surprise witness was invaluable to the sheriff in shedding some fresh light on this bizarre, erroneous and baffling case. "This is Michelle," said the sheriff, introducing me to the witness, a man called Michael Ambleflaw, who studied me with interest. "She's our artist. She'll be able to draw the face that you saw. The sooner we get his profile down on paper, the sooner someone might be able to recognise him. Even someone from out of town who might be able to know who the strange man is. Help us to get to the bottom of this very indecipherable case." I nodded. "I hope to be able to do a good job," I said. "Did you get a good view of his face?" I asked the young man. Michael nodded. "I do believe so. A very distinctive face, not one I think I would forget in a hurry. But it wasn't a face that I've seen before, so I reckon he's not from around here. Otherwise, he would look familiar to me. I'll leave you to it, Michelle, said the sheriff, as he watched me settling down at the table with my drawing pad and pencil. I'm in no doubt people will sleep a lot better in their beds at night, the sooner we catch this imbecile. Do you mind me asking you a few questions? You see, as an artist, I need to get a full impression of the man, not just a physical one, if you understand. I know it sounds strange, but it makes my picture flow more easily if I have a greater sense of him. It makes him become more alive in my mind's eye, reflects favourably on my sketches. You spotted him when returning from the bar with friends, is that right? The young man nodded. It was a spot of luck, really, that I noticed him at all. You see, the Bradford pear tree is literally feet away from my sister's bedroom window. There was a little wind that night, so the graceful branches of the tree were swaggering. I remember thinking the tree looked inebriated, just like I was feeling. I'd drunk a little too much that evening. It was a private joke that I was having with myself. For let's not kid, when you're tipsy, the strangest things can be terribly funny. Well, in my peripheral vision, I saw a solid, substantial movement at my sister's window. Oh, it turned my blood icy cold. It alerted my senses to the realization that something was wrong, very wrong. My eyes quickly darted towards the tree. I looked through the branches. That was when I discerned the dense silhouette of a man in black. If I hadn't been looking so intently, I doubt I would have seen him. His dark clothes made him very inconspicuous. I didn't have to think twice about it. I knew at once he was the Peeping Tom that everyone is so flustered about of late. Rightly so. There's something not right about the man. He's clearly unhinged, lost his marbles. Even when I saw the man up close and personal, I got that kind of intuitive feedback about him, let's just say. When you say he was loitering around your sister's window, did you actually see him peering inside? Oh, I saw him peering inside, all right. He was having a jolly good look. I'm convinced he saw my sister undressing. The lights were on in her bedroom. She would have been lightly turning in for the night, getting attired into her nightdress. It would have been a very vulnerable, inauspicious moment for her. Does your sister know about this? Are you kidding? Of course not. I would never let my parents know about this. They wouldn't cope with such knowledge. I informed the sheriff not to breathe a word of this to them, or it would distress them immeasurably. As for my sister, it would freak her out, especially if she knew someone was spying on her. It would make her paranoid. The last thing I need is for my family to stress out. People in town are all very wound up of late. One doesn't need to add fuel to the fire. What do you think he wants? I asked. Isn't it obvious? He's a pervert. No doubt about it in my mind. My sister's pretty, but I gather he's been loitering around old ladies' houses as well, like a noxious bad smell. Goodness knows what the man is after. What did he look like? I asked. Well, he was young, about my age, maybe a little older, possibly 21 or 22. He was slender, built, I suppose, tall, an olive complexion, deep-set dark eyes, very thick, buoyant black hair. He looked as if he could have some Italian lineage, I imagine. A very striking Roman nose. And, yes, well, a railway track raised scar under his eyes, just over here. It had become quite white as opposed to the rest of his skin. It would be exceedingly easy to spot him a mile off if you saw a scar like that, for it sticks out like a sore thumb. Unless, of course, he managed to cover it up with makeup, I suggested. I hadn't thought about that, said the man. I suppose that's a distinct possibility, especially if he knows people are looking out for him. Once I'd finished drawing the sketch, I showed the witness my picture. That's him, said the man. I can't believe it. It's actually him. It must have been a couple of days after drawing the police sketch, when I was in a local coffee shop having coffee with a girlfriend of mine, that something aroused my attention, as the picture of the Peeping Tom was hanging in my mind like a brand new outfit that I couldn't stop thinking about. Indeed, I couldn't think of anything else since I'd applied that pencil to paper. As usual, the conversation that morning veered towards the Peeping Tom in our town, who was robbing all of its citizens of a good night's sleep. The men were worried about their daughters and wives. The women were concerned about their safety. Presumably all sensed that in a matter of time the Peeping Tom could potentially morph into a rapist or murderer. Many women, young and old, trembled every night when they switched off their lights, ever mindful that looming in the dark shadows was a predator waiting to strike if given half a chance. "I'm just so glad a witness has finally stepped forward, that you were able to draw a picture of him," said my friend Sally, sipping her coffee reflectively. "It was exceedingly brave of the young man to pull off the peeper's hoodie. Fortunately, he got a good view of the anomalous stranger, which is a flying start for everyone. The good news is that with a scar like that under his eyes, someone is bound to spot him sooner or later. I mean, the pictures of him are all around town now, on every telegraph pole. But no one seems to know who he is or where he's from. That's the strange thing about it all. I mean, what ails a young man like that to go peeking on women like this, especially old vulnerable women? Even so, by all accounts, he hasn't really done anything wrong yet, has he?" "Are you kidding, Sally?" I snapped. "Of course he's done something wrong. He was watching two elderly women sleep. He broke into their houses in the middle of the night. I think he's working up the courage for upgrading his attacks from the benign to something infinitely more sinister. But he's not quite there yet. We need to catch him in time before his nefarious fantasies become acted out in our reality." It was in that moment I glanced up towards the delicatessens. I saw the lanky silhouette of a young man piling a couple of doughnuts into a brown paper bag. There was something about his mannerism, the swift movements, that got my attention. He seemed shifty, his eyes darting around the coffee shop to see if anyone was paying him any attention. They weren't. I couldn't see his facial profile closely enough. I needed a much better look. I excused myself from the table. "Where are you going?" asked Sally. "One of those doughnuts is calling my name. I'm going to get it." I moved willfully towards the tray of doughnuts on display, standing a hair's breadth away from the young man, who had turned his attention away from the doughnuts and was mindfully hovering over the cinnamon buns like a bee over a can of cola. In his hands was another open brown bag. It seemed he was wrestling with himself indecisively, whether to get 3 or 4 cinnamon buns, as the tongs in his hands seemed to waver. "I would make it 4. 4 cinnamon buns," I said. "You can never have too many. Besides, this coffee shop makes the best gooey cinnamon buns in town. The saying less is more does not apply in this case. I would say more is infinitely more preferable." The young man looked up at me for a second. His intense brown eyes met mine. Then I saw it. Granted, it was covered by a pale splash of makeup, 2 shades lighter than his own skin, but yes, it was the indisputable scar from my picture of the town Peeping Tom. I was in no doubt about this. I had found him. I could hardly believe it. The excitement welled up in my veins, while my heart began to thunder so fast in my chest. I was sure everybody could hear it. "You're probably right," said the man, placing another bun in his bag. "More is preferable." Then he headed towards the counter to pay for his baked goods. "Thanks," he said. I nodded, dashing over to the table where Sally was drinking her coffee. She looked up at me in surprise. "Where's your doughnut? I thought you said it was calling your name." "Oh no, you haven't already eaten it, have you?" "Sorry, Sally. Let's take a rain check on coffee this morning. Something's just come up." What? I didn't hear her words as I darted out of the coffee shop and surreptitiously hid myself behind a telephone box in the street, waiting for the young man to make his appearance. Then I saw him coming out of the shop, walking towards the bus stop, where he stood in line behind a couple of elderly ladies who were nattering away excitedly to each other about the latest Andy Griffith show. It wasn't long before the young man hopped onto the local bus, carrying in his hand a large white plastic bag, which I guess contained some of the baked goods that he had just bought. I was following close behind him, ever grateful not to be observed. I sat down on my seat, only to sense the brown eyes of the young man boring into mine like an angry buzzard. I noticed his expression looked dark. He wasn't pleased to see me. I waved at him cordially, putting on a cheerful smile on my face, feigning that I was equally as surprised to see him as he was to see me. "Who would have thought I'd see you again?" I joked. It's such a small world beyond the bakery. The young man's face visibly relaxed. He turned away from me to face the front of the bus. He slouched back comfortably onto the seat, his long, lanky legs stretched out before him. He was the kind of person you'd hate to sit next to on a plane, for he would greedily steal all the legroom. I watched him opening the brown bag to eat one of his cinnamon buns, chewing it slowly as he glanced out of the windows as a few scant raindrops trickled from the darkening skies, splattering their pitiful deluge against the panes. The bus drove into the heart of the countryside, past exquisite green fields, tobacco, cotton and sweet potato farms, along with little barns and scatterings of pretty trees that clustered the landscape in verdant celestial gatherings, past a mesmerizing silvery lake that twinkled under the soft dancing light of the sun, rather like a reflectant silvery jewel. The young man tapped the bell to announce his desire to disembark. The bus ground to a stop, making that horrible squeaking psh sound when compressed air is finally released. It ground to a halt, waiting for its passengers to disembark. I raised myself off my feet to climb off the bus after the man. At this point I knew that I couldn't hide myself from him, so I got off the bus boldly, my head held high with a purposeful resolve. At this the young man looked heartily annoyed. "You again? If I didn't know any better, I'd think you were following me. What's your problem, lady? Who put you up to this?" "Of course I'm not following you. I live around here," I lied brazenly. The young man looked exceedingly doubtful. "There's not much human habitation around here, lady. No one gets off the bus here, but clearly you do, which is a turn-up for the books. It's remote out here, not a soul around for miles. You expect me to believe your tall, fabricated story? Lady, you're following me. I'd like to know why. I have a right to know. I smelt a rat the moment you started talking about those cinnamon buns at the coffee shop. I mean, who does that?" "That's where you're very wrong," I said, thinking quickly on my feet. "I happen to travel around in a Winnebago, if you must know. It's illegally parked around there, on that farmer's field over there," I said, pointing in the distance. "You shouldn't think the worst of people, just because I happen to get off the bus at the same stop as you did. I mean, why on earth would I be following you? The idea is ludicrous," I said, giving an exaggerated sigh and shaking my long mane of hazel-brown hair rather too vigorously. At this I proceeded to take a right turn, walking through the trees, nodding to him as I did, not daring to turn around as I walked forward, for I knew beyond question he was still watching me. Why I never felt apprehensively overwrought about what I was doing is something that boggles me to this very day. I think I secretly fancied the idea of opening the local paper, with the stark, blazing headlines, "Fearless North Carolina Girl Valiantly Discovers the Whereabouts of the Town Peeping Tom, Leading to His Arrest, and to the Resummation of Much-Needed Peace to the Local Community," when I was sure the young man had been fooled by my fabulously guileful act, of which even I applauded. I was feeling marvellously impressed with myself. I hadn't even given anything away, but maintained my cool, despite his audacious interrogation of me. I was confident that he had been deceived by my act. I was beginning to secretly fancy myself as an undercover officer. I would be absolutely brilliant at the job. I turned around to retreat from whence I'd come, back onto the long red dirt road, with so many trees dotting the landscape on either side. I knew that providing I stealthily darted from one tree to another on the raised embankment, I could follow him easily under cover. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this man was the town Peeping Tom, for that scar under his eyes, that was so badly concealed by a thin coat of foundation, was a huge giveaway. It had to be him. I knew it with every fibre of my being. I mean, who else could it be? He'd gone to such lengths to conceal his scar. If he had nothing to hide, then why would he do it? He knew he was a wanted man, that was why. Consequently, with my picture taking precedence over every telephone pole in town, he was running scared, possibly seeking shelter in a wooded area, lying low, camping rough. I meant to find out where his location was so that I could lead the police directly to him like the cat to the mouse hole. I watched the young man walk down the dirt road. He wasn't wearing his usual dark regalia. Instead, he was wearing a long pair of bell-bottom, slim-fitting faded blue jeans, a white polo shirt, while a patterned sports jacket was tied around his waist. He kicked the ground with his boots, occasionally stopping dead in his tracks to look behind him, as if he sensed that someone was watching him. I noticed he seemed unsettled, perturbed, even annoyed. He was definitely behaving like a man who had something to hide. As I was trailing him, I got the sense that I too was being trailed. Now I knew my imagination had to be playing tricks on me, yet I was certain something else was following me. I could hear a distinct rustle, the ominous sound of underbrush being crunched beneath heavy bipedal feet. It even felt as if the ground seemed to boom ever so slightly. I tossed my wavering doubts to one side, secretly chastising myself for having such a colourful, vibrant imagination. Once again the grey skies struggled to cry, as they sprinkled a few droplets of rain onto the ground, some hitting my cheek with a refreshing wetness, but then again, as quickly as it had started, the rain receded. I was ever grateful for such small mercies, for the last thing I wanted was to be caught out in the rain. For then where would I seek cover while waiting for another bus heading back to town? And that could take a long time. All of a sudden the young man turned around in the dirt road. He stood as still as a statue, his back as straight as a pencil, almost as if his senses had been alerted. He reminded me of a startled white-tailed deer that had picked up the scent of a predator on the wind. For a while he said nothing. His eyes scanned the terrain. He looked intently at every tree that fringed the embankment. Oh my God, I thought. He knows I'm following him. Perhaps I'm not so discreet after all. Maybe my masterful powers of sleuthing weren't so artful after all as I'd initially perceived. "I know you're there, lady," came the young man's voice. "You think this is some kind of a joke, following me like this?" At that I remained very still, hardly daring to breathe. But as I stood still, I discerned something else breathing in close proximity to me, so much so, in fact, that I could feel the vaporous breath on the back of my neck. Whatever it was, it sounded alarmingly like a horse. I was startled. I looked around my immediate vicinity, and standing about a foot behind me was the biggest hairy giant that I've ever seen. What the heck was it? I wondered in horror. I was so terrified, completely taken off guard, that I wanted to scream. But I realised that the creature's demeanour was playful, almost as if he thought my stalking the Peeping Tom was some kind of fun game of which he wanted to play an intrinsic part. I was astounded by his presumptions. I discerned he had a youthful, playful, jubilant energy, which suggested he was a juvenile. Yet how could he be? He was 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, for goodness sake. He was monstrously big, burly, strapping, exceedingly intimidating. In those days I'd never heard of a Bigfoot or even the abominable snowman, so I was flummoxed as to what he could be. I studied the creature through intrigued eyes. The fear I had initially felt dissipated, like the smoke rising from a chimney. This creature was terribly friendly towards me, not possessing any aggressive tendencies that would lead me to feel afraid. Besides, he was remarkably human. The only way I can describe the gargantuan creature to you is that he looked like a wild man, covered in long flowing brown hair, with overlong arms, powerful legs, a pyramid-shaped head, and the face that was so human it was astonishing. Deep-set dark eyes, flat nose, square jawline, high cheekbones, sloped forehead. He looked as if Native American Cherokee lineage was coursing through his veins, for he had the look, or appearance, of a noble Indian chief, if you like. I could hear the footsteps of the young man approaching us, while the strange creature was indicating for me to hide. He was flustered, jubilant, excited, enthusiastic. His sparkling brown eyes absolutely thrilled, enamoured, like a kid involved in an exciting, fabulous game of hide-and-seek. I sensed he really thought that this was the most phenomenal game. Of course he did. I desperately tried to hide. I didn't fancy being interrogated by the suspicious young man again. I scrambled for cover, behind a tree, but my movements were clumsy, bumbling, uncoordinated. I slipped on a gnarled root, finding myself staring into the eyes of the indignant man. My worst nightmare coming to pass. This is not what I had anticipated. Brown, enraged, belligerent eyes bored into mine. I could hear a snorting sound from behind one of the trees from the strange creature, who was obviously finding the fact that I'd been caught out terribly funny. On reflection, I suppose his kind are so brilliant at hiding in plain sight that my thumbling inability to succeed in such a simple endeavour must have been terribly amusing to him. I think I get that. Lady, why the heck are you following me? There's no Winnebago, is there? You made all that up. You've been following me since you found me in the coffee shop. Who hired you?" "I know who you are," I said, waving an accusory finger at him. "I know who you are." "Well, at least that's a start. Then finally you might start telling me the truth, woman." "The name is Michelle," I corrected him. "Well, at least you can finally tell me the truth, Michelle. Who hired you to follow me? Was it Millie Parker? Ha! I might have known. You can tell her for me that I'm not coming back. I never will. Tell her to leave me alone, to stop hounding me. I made my decision. I don't want to live with her. Get it? Tell her I'm old enough to make it on my own. She has no legal hold over my life anymore. I don't need her breathing down my back, for goodness sake. The woman has never been there for me. She thinks a touch of sobriety changes everything. Tell her I am tired of being stalked. I'm tired. I've had enough." "Millie Parker," I said, gulping the air in surprise, as if I was choking on it. "I don't know any Millie Parker. I don't know what you're talking about." "So then, if it wasn't Millie who hired you, then who did? You're a private detective, right? If you don't mind my saying, you're pretty lousy at your job. I figured you were following me way back. You should possibly consider another profession. You're a pathetic sleuth." I could feel the anger and indignation rising up in my face. "How dare you? I'm a very good sleuth. I found you after all, when the whole town is looking for you. I know exactly who you are. You're the Peeping Tom. That's why I've been following you. The police need to be informed of your whereabouts. You've been spotted prying into people's windows at night, watching women undress in compromising positions. You're a pervert, the lowest of the low." "What?" said the young man, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. "You think I'm a Peeping Tom? I've heard everything now. I've been called many things in my life, but a Peeping Tom, that cuts the cake. What are you smoking, woman?" "I'm smoking nothing. I'm a police artist. I happen to know that you're the perpetrator. I drew you myself." "Oh, I see. You're the one that drew those printed pictures all around town that have been posted up everywhere. I've got to admit, they do look uncannily like me. The resemblance is remarkable, but I assure you they're not me. I am not the Peeping Tom." "But you have the same scar as the perpetrator," I insisted, pointing to the area under his eye. "You're hiding the scar under your eye, concealing it with foundation. The Peeping Tom has the same scar. In my book, there are no coincidences." "I hide my scar, woman. It's unsightly. And it's not a scar, if you must know. It's a birthmark." "That doesn't change anything." All of a sudden, a couple of pine cones came flying towards us. "What the heck is that?" said the young man, stopping dead in his tracks, when the jubilant, delighted figure of the big hairy creature made his rambunctious appearance known. He was like one of those boisterous dogs, thumping around the place in an excited frenzy, obliviously unaware of the disadvantages and ramifications of his huge, monstrous size. The creature was not appreciating being ignored. The young man looked astonished on seeing the critter, so much so that for a fleeting second I seriously thought he was going to pass out from the sheer shock of it. His mouth hung open like a Venus flytrap. His eyes grew round like saucers. "Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" He began to run away from the creature as fast as he could, with me trailing after him, along with the hairy creature by my side, who thought this nonsensical game was getting better every second, as all the running, hiding, and screaming were exceedingly exciting in his book. All of a sudden I could hear the most deadly roar, as something was screaming blue murder from the woods. Whatever it was charging towards us like a herd of bison, beating, pounding, cracking the earth, causing the ground to heave, groan, and vibrate. In that moment, the ear-piercing, shrill, discomposing sound caused us to stop dead in our tracks, like when the music stops in a game of musical chairs. It was the most bone-chilling sound I've ever heard. It caused my blood to freeze over. The large, hairy, very playful creature became stoic and quiet. He let out a frightened whimper, as though scared or rather intimidated. It was clear he knew who was coming our way. perceived that he was in trouble, big trouble, from what I assume must be a belligerent parent. The poor comical creature begrudgingly glided away towards the sound, his eyes filled with disappointment. I could hear the angry background raised voice of a female, which I deduced must be the creature's mother, giving him a piece of her mind, possibly telling him to stay well away from humans if he knew what was good for him. The young man who I was to discover was called Ivan insisted on taking the bus right back with me to visit the police station to prove that he had absolutely nothing to hide and that he was definitely not the peeper. I want to prove to you that I'm no Peeping Tom. Yes, I was hiding from my mother, Millie, who believes now that her days of alcoholic intoxication are behind her, that I should be there to entertain her during her sobriety, to help her while away the boring, monotonous drudgery of her daily life. She abandoned me when I was young. She never wanted me around, but now she wants me there all the time, to control my life. She refuses to allow me to have space or any independence. I'm far too old to be under my mother's clutches, but she appears to think very differently about the matter. I've run away a couple of times from her before. She's trailed me every time with a private detective on my back. So that was why I was lying low, camping out in the woods. As you can imagine, I felt like a complete idiot when a couple of weeks later the real perpetrator, or Peeping Tom, was actually caught. I certainly felt as if I had egg on my face. He was a mentally ill, seriously disturbed man who had run away from the mental facility, was fixated by women. He was on medication to suppress his amorous sexual urges. If he hadn't been caught in time, the stalking could ultimately have morphed into rape. When I saw the man's picture in the paper, he was a dead ringer for Ivan, with a similar scar under the eye. But I suppose weirder things have happened. As for the creature I encountered, it was definitely a Bigfoot. It was so funny how he stumbled up to me when I was trailing Ivan and thought it was all terribly exciting, rather like a fabulous game of which he wanted to partake. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I grabbed my sister excitedly, indicating for her to remain very quiet, so as not to draw any attention to either of us. I pointed deliberately towards a silvery stream that meandered through the heavily forested valley with a forceful, rambunctious current, where white, bubbly, foamy waves of water crashed over voluptuous sculptural boulders with a powerful, tenacious determination. The sound of the water so loud that many of the pretty background noises of the chirping and trilling, whistling birds became somewhat faint, almost inaudible, lost against the blasting thrashes of the water. "Look over there! See him?" I said, trying to raise my voice enough for my sister to hear me, as our voices were drowned out by the noises of the water. "Where?" asked my sister. "Where? See what? I can't see anything." She looked frustrated as she peered through the curtain of shrubbery that generously draped the gaps between two trees, rather like a spidery web that overlooked the water. Her sharp, keen eyes looking for something out of place, but the stream along with the scattering of towering ponderosa pines looked totally normal. There was nothing that looked different to her, or that grabbed her attention. She frowned, looking at me defeated, conquered by her disappointment, wearing an infuriated expression on her face. "Don't tease me. I don't see anything. Nothing is there. You're not winding me up, are you?" "Of course not, Lucy. Why would I do that? Over there, standing at the edge of the water. Can't you see him?" "But isn't that a tree stump?" My sister followed the line of my finger towards the obscure, dense, hefty form. It looked like a huge, broken tree trunk. "No, silly. That isn't a tree trunk. Can't you see it's moving? See those swaggering branches? They're not branches at all. They're hefty arms. See the head? That's not a stub. That's a distinctive, pronounced head with a distinguishable pointed tip." "Oh, my word!" said my sister, looking stumped. "Oh, by golly! By Jesus, you're right! It's not a tree stump. But what is it? It's moving! It's really moving!"
My sister and I were born with curiosity attached to our surname like a double barrel, so neither of us needed much encouragement to surreptitiously creep towards the anomalous sighting. We were familiar with bears. We had seen them on multiple occasions before, but this creature was something decidedly different. What on earth was he? We couldn't even begin to imagine. We were eager to find out the answer to this curious conundrum that had hijacked our immediate interest. We knew we would not be happy until we found out exactly what it was, or we would be left wondering, always speculating about what we'd seen. So there was no time like the present to find the answer. Luckily, I had my small binoculars with me that had been given to me by my grandfather, whom had told me that every aspiring young hunter needs a good view of his quarry. So I wore those field glasses around my neck proudly every day when we went out rambling in the countryside, like an indigenous Indian warrior might wear a necklace of eagle feathers, or perhaps a cannibal would wear a string of human teeth, or worse still, a gruesome display of human digits. Horrible thought, really. So with trembling hands and a degree of trepidation, along with a very pronounced sense of inquisitiveness, I began to focus on the burly, dense, stubby tree trunk that appeared to be some kind of brooding, rather bemused-looking critter that was seemingly heavily preoccupied with something on the edge of the stream. Perhaps he was looking to catch a fish, I thought. Maybe a bass. I'd seen a lot of sizable bass in the stream. The water was so crystal clear, it was easy to see the fish darting through the water. The current was so vigorous, and at times often treacherous. If you were small, it wouldn't take much to be swept away by the somewhat lethal white water. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" I said to my sister, my eyes growing round with excitement as if the dawn had been suddenly broken by a revelatory blazing bright light. "I think it's a Bigfoot! I think it's a Bigfoot!" "Let's see," said my sister, exuberantly snatching the binoculars from me. Shaking like a leaf, she applied the lenses to her own eyes, while assiduously adjusting the focus. She nodded excitedly. "It's a Bigfoot! It's a Bigfoot!" She was virtually jumping up and down on her little legs with such incredible enthusiasm, rather reminding me of a boisterous puppy that can't stop bouncing between your legs. "Oh my golly! It's a Bigfoot!" I wasted no time in recovering my binoculars from my riveted sister, who seemed hell-bent on monopolizing them for herself. A far cry from the girl who'd initially concluded that binoculars were a naff gift. Now she seemingly wanted ownership of them. That was not going to happen. I consumed and immersed myself in studying the creature curiously through the binoculars. I perceived it must have been exceedingly tall, as the water in the stream came up to his knees. The wet hair of his lower limbs clung to his sizable muscular legs, exposing the grey skin beneath. It wasn't very shallow in that spot, as I had learnt from my own personal experience, having nearly drowned there once myself. I vividly recalled that time that I'd been forcefully pushed backwards by the powerful current and almost swept down the water. So I guess he was easily over 7 to 8 foot tall, definitely male, with a solid, dense body, as stocky, robust and burly as a redwood tree. Even the fine layers of his dark reddish-brown hair that swathed his body was a colour that was identical to the colour of the illustrious bark, so much so that he would have been perfectly camouflaged by the redwood trees in our wood grove. So perfectly, in fact, that if you were to walk through the sylvan while the creature remained as still as a statue, you would never have even known he was actually there. We had hit pay dirt in seeing him at all. We knew we were exceedingly lucky. We'd seen enough television programmes of intrepid explorers and their arduous, relentless feats and insufferable journeys over treacherous, sometimes precarious terrain, all in hot pursuit of the elusive, hairy humanoid beast that could slip through your field of vision faster than butter. What's more, many of these passionate adventurers had applied savvy procedures, using the advantages of modern technology, thermal night vision, calls and wood knocks, in order to lure in a Bigfoot like an unsuspecting fish to a fisherman's worm. More often than not, they would invariably leave empty-handed, their hearts heavy laden with bitter disappointment, their faces downcast, but a glimmer of hope always hung in their mind like a bright gleaming star. Maybe tomorrow would be different. The tragedy for most was that tomorrow never was different. It would seem the more you searched for the outlandish beast, the more it eluded you, like an annoying, frustrating game of cat and mouse. Even being young and naive, and possibly a tad foolish at the time, I still perceived that this was indeed an extreme honour, to have such an outlandish encounter with a hairy man like this. I was enthralled, captivated, prepossessed by his striking, profound humanness, as I was under the impression Bigfoot was very ape-like, but I did not find this to be the case, for this creature was more like a wild man than an ape. His pyramid-shaped head turned to look in our direction, his eyes perceptively intelligent. Did he know where we were hiding, I wondered? Had he seen us, or could he sense my field glasses upon him, studying him with a fierce, ferocious intensity? I could feel my heart thumping violently in my chest, my excitement escalating through my veins like a speeding train galloping through a dark tunnel. I noticed that even my breathing had sharpened to a swift speediness, as if I had swum hundreds upon hundreds of laps around my grandparents' kidney-shaped swimming pool, and was completely exhausted as a result. "It's a Bigfoot," I whispered. "I know it is." We watched the creature as it arched its Titanic-sized body over the water, pulling something from beneath the watery depths with his overlong, muscular arms. I could see him tugging and pulling at the water. Had he caught a bass or a catfish, I wondered? Then I saw it. Nothing prepared me for what I was about to witness. The memory of that moment is permanently seared in my mind, like a sailor's tattoo that can't be shifted. At first it looked like an arm that was limply attached to a soaked, sodden, dishevelled corpse of a woman, with very wet, tousled red hair, whom was dressed in a drenched, sullied, woolly green dress. The rumpled dress appeared to be saturated with red stains of blood that surprisingly had not been washed away by the swift current, but seemed to be stuck to her chest as if she'd been gashed to death with a violent force, possibly by one of the creature's powerfully large hands that could easily outrival the rounded bottom of a professional tennis racket. I imagine one blow from his hand would leave you unconscious. 2 strikes and you were definitely a goner. Not to put too fine a point on it, of course. My sister and I looked at each other in absolute terror, as if the enormity of what we had witnessed for us was like a landmine blowing off in our faces. My sister was wobbling uneasily, rather like an unsteady tray of delicate champagne glasses being brought back to the kitchen during a drinks party. "He's killed her," she cried. "He's only gone and throttled the poor woman to death, under the water like a crocodile. He's going to eat her. I know he is. If he sees us, he could eat us too." This, of course, was a horrifying revelation, but even I doubted that the Bigfoot would eat both the lady with the red hair, followed by me and my sister. But then maybe, like a crocodile, he'd kill his prey first, leave it to marinate in its juices, to soften for a few days, and then consume it. After all, isn't that what crocodiles did? Why would it be any different for him? It was all we could do not to scream at the top of our lungs, but such a careless, indiscreet act would have been very foolish, for it would have alerted the very astute, vigilant creature to our presence, subsequently propelling us like a BB gun into the heart of grievous danger. It would seem that our bodies were blasted like dynamite, as explosive surges of adrenaline coursed through our veins, activating the engine of our joints involuntarily. Our seemingly well-oiled legs gained momentum, finding a speed that neither of us had ever experienced before or since. A miraculous, phenomenal driving force, powered by fear, that would have made a skateboard seem slow and clumsy. We ran and ran towards our grandparents' colonial farmhouse, the air expunged from our lungs as we collapsed on the grassy verge like 2 half-drowned people, gasping to find any breath, grabbing desperately at the long grass to stabilize our trembling knees, to bring equilibrium and balance back, to steady our frazzled nerves. My grandfather, who was chopping firewood at the time, abandoned his gallant endeavours, hurrying speedily towards us like an ambulance in heavy traffic, his face so pale he looked like a ghost. "What happened? What happened, kids? Did you see a mountain lion? Was it a bear? You look so afraid. What the heck scared you half to death?" We shook our heads, trying to find the words, but they eluded us, stuck in the back of our throats like a cough lozenge that refused to budge. "Come with me. You've had a nasty shock." My grandmother was at the range, stirring a pot of corn chowder vigorously. She looked up when we entered the kitchen. Her cheerful expression was vanquished the moment she saw our terrified faces that trembled while our bodies jiggled, our legs becoming increasingly unstable. The kitchen seemed to sway, rock and wobble like a jolting fisherman's boat on a choppy, tumultuous ocean. "What happened? Oh, my God! What happened? Are you all right?" She clucked. She waddled around us in a dreadful state, like a devoted, rather frenzied mother duck, upset by the sight of a fox loitering around the stream, who was terrorizing her little ducklings and getting very indignant and heated up all about it. "Give them something sweet, dear. They're both in shock," said my grandfather. Before long, my grandmother had poured us long glasses of icy cold Coca-Cola, placing large chocolate brownies in front of us that in normal circumstances would have been gulped up in a second with a rapturous zeal. This was a turn-up for the books, as we were never normally allowed sweet things before meals. Today the boundaries of that hard and fast golden rule had come crashing down like a crumbling dam wall. We gratefully drank our colas in silence, eating our decadent brownies without saying a word, enjoying the sweet, rich taste on our tongues. Nothing could have been more gratifying in that moment, as the calmness descended over me like the soft rain after a hectic storm. Finally I spoke. We were playing hide and seek. We saw a Bigfoot by the stream. He killed a woman. He drowned her in the water. She had blood on her, lots of it, on her torso." My grandmother gasped at our morbid revelations. A predatory mountain lion stealthily loitering around would not be good news, but her 2 grandchildren physically witnessing a murder so graphically was not what she was expecting to hear from us. It unsettled her nerves, rattled her cage significantly, brought up the bitter taste of gall at the back of her throat, leaving her feeling violently sick. Only moments before, the delicious-looking corn chowder bubbling away on the gas hob had brought on those salivatory hunger signals that gallivanted through her brain, accompanied by a rumbling stomach. But now looking at it made her want to throw up and be violently ill. She knew she'd never be able to feel positive about corn chowder ever again. It had permanently lost its appeal. Her expression looked appalled. She was now shaking. Her unsteady, trembling hands were flung around her mouth in a gesture of nonplussed disbelief. "You witnessed a murder? You saw a young woman being killed? Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" I nodded. "A Bigfoot? You saw a Bigfoot? You saw him drown this poor helpless woman? I wonder who on earth she was, where she came from, what she was doing in our part of the woods." "What are we to do?" my grandmother cried, crippled by the rising level of angst that had seized her sense of reason, like a robber holding her to ransom. For a moment she looked confused, disorientated, overwhelmed, out of her depth, almost as if she'd been thrown into the deep end of a swimming pool when she couldn't swim a single stroke. "I'll get on to the sheriff pronto," said my grandfather, tapping his cell phone vigorously. "That's what we must do, call the sheriff. There's a dangerous Bigfoot out there. He needs to be taken out." "What about fish and game?" asked my grandmother. "Should you not call them? I mean, we're talking about a murderous Bigfoot, are we not? He's only gone and killed a poor woman. Drowned her, of all things. Could it get worse than that? I ask you, could it get worse than that? We can't have a monster hovering around the woods like this, especially not one that has a taste for human flesh. Next thing he'll be after us, extracting us from our home like a couple of sardines from a can. Then there'll be no stopping him. I do know that human flesh is supposed to taste exactly like pork, sweet. It might be delicious to him, succulent, tender. We're sitting ducks for the creature. It's only a matter of time before he pounces on us unaware." "I will tell the sheriff that my grandchildren saw a woman being drowned in the stream by an obscure, indistinct figure. If you think I'm going to ramble on to them about a Bigfoot, you've got another thing coming. They'd never take me seriously. I'm not about to admit anything of the sort. Let's just hope their fastidious investigations will lead them directly to the predator. Let them do all the conjecture and groundwork themselves, not me. Let them determine the murderous villain was a Bigfoot. But that erroneous word is not coming out of my mouth, not for a moment." I still think you should call Fish and Game, piped my grandmother. But her voice faded, as if she too was not certain on what the next move should actually be. One thing at a time, sweetheart. One thing at a time. Let's not run before we can walk, shall we? Let's see what the sheriff has to say in regards to the matter. Before long, several police trucks with flashing blue lights, along with an ambulance, arrived on the scene. Please go to the woods, said my grandfather as he spoke to some of the uniformed men. You need to go into the woods. Follow the hiking trail over there, near the stream, on the right-hand side. That's where my grandkids say they saw the deceased woman. Regretfully, the indistinguishable figure that drowned her. They didn't see very well, I'm afraid, but he could still be loitering around. By all accounts, he was exceedingly big. I would proceed with caution if I were you. As I was saying, he might still be loitering around those woods, so be very careful. He could be armed and dangerous. That was my grandfather's way of warning them to be very, very guarded. I watched several policemen running stealthily into the woods, their revolvers cocked, their expressions determined. Might I have a word with our two young witnesses? Asked the sheriff. Do you think they might be up to answering a few questions for me? It would be a great help in our investigation. Eyewitnesses are crucial, even if their testimonies are notoriously unreliable. But I need to establish some hard base facts. Please, Sheriff, said my grandmother, be my guest. My grandchildren have had a nasty shock, as you can imagine, but I'm sure they'll oblige you by answering a few questions. She said this, gesturing for the sheriff to sit down at the booth opposite us, which he did so unhesitantly, without much prompting. More Coke? My grandmother asked me. I nodded. And you, Lucy? Would you like some more Coke? My sister nodded. How about you, Sheriff? A fizzy glass of Coca-Cola? Coffee? Tea? Anything? She asked. A fizzy glass of cola would do very nicely, said the sheriff. Not that my waistline will agree with that. My wife tirelessly complains about my sugar addiction. But you can see why sugar is a quintessential part of the job as a sheriff. For in horrifying situations like this, quite simply, nothing else will do. Sugar may be many things, but nothing beats it for steadying the nerves, let me assure you. Now, son, what is your name? Asked the sheriff, looking at me directly through his steely blue eyes, pulling out his pad and pen to make a few brief notes. My name is Wesley Bonnet, sir. This is my sister Lucinda, but we call her Lucy for short. I see, said the sheriff, pulling off his cowboy hat, placing it beside him on the booth. I noticed his hair was shaved within an inch of his life, but the spiky hairs glistened from the heated sweat generated from wearing a hat. And how old are you, Wesley? I'm 11. My sister's 10. Now exactly what did you see? Try to think about it all very slowly, so the details become very clear in your mind. Think of it as if you're describing a picture to me, a work of art, maybe a picture you've drawn. What do you see? I trembled awkwardly on my words, abiding my grandfather's rigid advice to avoid mentioning the Bigfoot at any cost. Sir, I saw the dead body of the woman. She was being dragged from beneath the lake. At first it was her arm, followed by the rest of her body. She was covered in lots and lots and lots of blood. She was being murdered under the water, sir. Did you see her receive the lethal blow that caused all this bleeding? No, but I saw the man. I didn't see him clearly, sir, but he was dragging her out of the water once he'd killed her. You've done very well, son. Can you remember a distinguishing feature of the perpetrator? Large, you say? He asked, raising a questioning brow. And hairy, piped my sister. Hairy! Lots and lots of brown hair! At that precise, poignant moment, a police officer raced into the kitchen, causing all eyes to focus directly on him. He seemed flustered, excited, as though he had ants in his pants, almost as if he was bursting at the seams to give the sheriff some juicy inside information. Had he spotted the Bigfoot, I wondered? Might I have a word, Sheriff? He said. Something's come up of significance. The sheriff nodded, while the uniformed officer whispered into the sheriff's ears. I thought I heard the words, red hair, green dress. I almost thought I heard the man snigger. as a muffled snort emanated from his mouth, as if he was desperately trying to suppress a giggle. On hearing the man's whispering confession, the corner of the sheriff's mouth twitched as he struggled to suppress a very big grin. "Did this woman you saw, by any chance, lying there deceased, did she happen to be wearing a green jersey dress? Did she have red hair?" We nodded. "That's right. That's her, sir. Clear as day." At that, the sheriff nodded at the officer, as if giving him the go-ahead in regards to some outlandish mission. The man dutifully returned into our kitchen, dragging behind him a large life-size bedraggled mannequin, like the ones you see gracing the front windows of Macy's, sporting some new designer wear. "Is this what you saw?" asked the sheriff, lifting up a sodden mannequin with red hair that was attired in a green dress, with what appeared to be bright red splashes of red paint across the front that looked from a distance remarkably like blood. Had all this been a horrible set-up, some kind of macabre twisted joke, I wondered? The mannequin was alarmingly lifelike. I'd never seen one look so human before. I felt so embarrassed. The blood rushed to my cheeks. Now I was beginning to feel really silly. Really silly. I nodded. "That's her, sir. I didn't realise she was a doll. We didn't realise. She looked so real, sir. So real. Especially from a distance." The sheriff burst out laughing, as did the other officer, joined by my grandmother and grandfather. The sheriff had one of those infectious laughs that sounded like an owl hoot, combined with a coyote bark, that was so hilarious that the kitchen was just filled with laughter, as no one was able to suppress their heightened giggles. The mannequin not being a dead body was funny, but the sheriff's laughter was funnier still, as his chest spurted like a whale's spout, eliminating sounds that were so comical even a stone statue would not have been immune. "Oh my God, this is so funny," said the sheriff. "In all my born days, I've never laughed this much." He wiped the tears away from his eyes. "Wait until the missus, the wife, hears about this. This story will be discussed at every dinner party in the foreseeable future. One thing you can never accuse me of is having a boring job. Being a sheriff keeps you on your toes, even if you are fishing out the unsuspecting corpse of a bedraggled mannequin from a stream." Once again the sheriff appeared tickled pink by his own twinkling remarks that glittered with humour. He let out another one of his hooting laughs. While my grandfather was laughing so much that his body was virtually doubled over. "Please, someone," he begged, "stop me from laughing so much. My stomach is bloody killing me. If I laugh any more, I'm going to bloody explode." After the sheriff and his team had finally left, relief flooded my grandparents' cosy Californian home like a warm shower on a sunny day. It did not make me and Lucy feel particularly good, for we felt that the adults were laughing at our expense. Needless to say that apart from the mannequin, both my grandparents genuinely were impressed that we had encountered a Bigfoot. I'm pleased to say they did not doubt our account, as my grandmother herself had once had a random sighting of one when hanging out her washing to dry one sunny afternoon. She said the creature had appeared curious, watching her for a long while, and disappearing back into the heart of the woods. "I think we're dealing with a curious Bigfoot," she surmised, ferreting around the stream, stumbling across a mannequin. But what on earth was a lifelike doll doing in the stream? What was all that red paint about on the dress that looked specifically like blood, as if it had been strategically placed for maximum effect? It's decidedly bizarre. I feel as if we're bang in the middle of an Agatha Christie novel. Little did we realise that answers to those rather enigmatic, curious questions would soon hasten their approach. I think it must have been about the second last day of our stay on my grandparents' beguiling Californian farm before we were headed back to Los Angeles to resume our city lives with our parents. We much preferred it out here in the vibrant, viridescent countryside, under the magnificent awning of a cobalt blue sky, surrounded by the mystical, statuesque, masterful redwood trees and ancient, giant secular groves. It must have been drawing close to lunchtime. My sister and I were playing with jigsaw puzzles on the booth, while my grandmother was busying herself stirring a huge vat of macaroni cheese on the range, rolling up meatballs. The smell of melted cheese and fried onions wafted around the kitchen. In a trice we heard the sound of a large truck rolling down the driveway. Its tyres squeaked as they scrunched pebbles beneath hefty, substantial rubber upholstering. The truck ground to a swift halt. A door slammed behind it as the passenger exited the vehicle, and finally the clip-clop of women's sandals could be distinguished as they approached our front door. A knocking sound of the brass horseshoe knocker could be heard, beating against the wood, followed by the shrill whistle of the doorbell that coursed through the house like an irritating siren. "Who's that?" said my grandmother, washing the excess stickiness off her fingers, drying them swiftly on a cloth attached to her apron. She bustled hurriedly towards the front door. "Oh, do come in, Priscilla," said my grandmother, directing the poised, very elegant woman into the kitchen. She was very glamorous. She was a glamorous grandmother if I ever saw one. Her whiter-than-white hair was tied back in a neat coiled bun. Her flawless pale skin looked like it had been stroked within an inch of its life, with copious tender loving treatments at a beauty salon. For the wrinkles, if there had been any, had abandoned her face like a herd of wild horses. The woman walked like a ballerina, an elegant gait, a straight deportment, a graceful walk. If I was to compare her to the animal species, she was like an Afghan hound visiting a couple of juvenile rambunctious Jack Russells, that being me and my sister, of course, and a jovial bulldog, the bulldog being my grandmother. "Now this is a surprise, Priscilla," said my grandmother. "Why, I do not believe you've ever graced the threshold of our home before. To what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" "I just need a brief word," said Priscilla, biting her perfectly painted bright orange lips together rather awkwardly. "I feel I owe you an explanation about, well, you know, the strange body you found floating in the stream. That, well, wasn't a body, if you understand what I'm talking about." "You know about that?" asked my grandmother. "Oh, doesn't news travel around fast in these parts? You have me intrigued." "Please sit down here with my grandkids. This is my grandson Wesley, and this is his sister Lucy. They're staying with me for the holidays. They were the ones that saw the doll that they falsely assumed was a dead body. It was an easy mistake to make, because it was one of the best mannequins we've ever seen in our lives." Oh dear," said Priscilla. "What I put you through! The police, the ambulance, the false alarm. Oh, I'm so sorry." She said this clasping her hands around her head in a gesture of despair. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. None of this is your fault, Priscilla," said my grandmother. "Goodness gracious, woman. Besides anything, we did have a very good laugh about it." "Oh, but it is my fault," Priscilla insisted. "Can I get you something to drink, Priscilla?" "That would be very nice. Anything you've got going would be lovely. I'll make you a cup of tea. English breakfast would be nice. Oh, it smells good in here. All that melted cheese. It's making my stomach positively rumble." "Well, if that's the case, Priscilla, I insist that you stay for lunch with us. I think I'll give you a glass of white wine. It complements cheese superbly." "If you're sure," said Priscilla. "I would be mad to refuse you." After my mother had poured Priscilla a large glass of Sauvignon Blanc, after a few sips she seemed to be a lot calmer. "I'll start at the very beginning, shall I? Well, when I was a lot younger, I worked in a fabulously prestigious boutique in Los Angeles. I was in my early 20s at the time. Most of our clients were movie stars, people with lots and lots of money. The mannequins in the shop were absolutely incredible, so lifelike, so magnificently beautiful. Even some of our customers believed we actually had live women in the window modelling our clothes. That's how lifelike they were. I sold a dress to Elizabeth Taylor once. I think it was an electric blue natty shift number. It looked absolutely fabulous on her, suited her perma tan, brought out her purple eyes. Then Audrey Hepburn, well, she was a very keen shopper of ours. She loved our Pixie range of clothes. The chic gamin style with its Hubert Givenchy influences rarely suited her look rather remarkably. Anyway, when I left that boutique to get married, my boss wanted to give me a gift. I didn't hesitate. I wanted the red-haired mannequin in the window that I'd called Layla. I was amazed when my boss agreed to give her to me. You see, I'm a bit of a seamstress. I knew that Layla could be useful for some of my design projects. I was hoping to start up my own clothing line, but marriage got in the way of that, and also the distraction of raising your own children. Anyway, my daughter Christina married an aspiring film producer in Hollywood. He always got his son, which is my grandson Clarkson, to take part as an extra in movies, stuff like that, so he got very involved with Universal Studios. Well, about a week ago my grandson with a few of his young friends came to stay at my home. I agreed to it against my better judgment. I didn't know what a handful they would turn out to be, but that's besides the point. The kids decided they wanted to play cops and robbers, but my grandson insisted that they needed a proper body with real blood in order to make the scene graphically real to merit a true police investigation. You see, with the influences of Universal Studios having rubbed off on him, he had become exposed to the makeup and costumes, so he wanted the game to have some semblance of reality. All the kids, of course, naturally thought this was a fabulous idea. "We need a dead body," my grandson insisted. "How can we arrest a thug if we haven't got a dead body?" That was when Clarkson remembered my mannequin. He asked me if I had some red paint and an old dress that I didn't want, so the paint could be used on the dress to denote the presence of blood, to make the scene visually graphic. I was to discover that during the game of cops and robbers, they had decided that the body should be found floating in the stream. But the current was so rambunctious, Layla was unfortunately swept away. They couldn't catch her. "I see," said my grandmother. "I think that explains an awful lot, as how that lifelike doll was swept downstream, ending up in our watering hole." And so it was the pieces began to fit together very nicely. But even though the doll we established was not real, the Bigfoot most certainly was. I only regret the fact that I falsely concluded he was responsible for an insidious crime that he most certainly did not commit. In reality, all the Bigfoot was guilty of was retrieving a large mannequin-like doll from the water. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, me and my best friend Toby Bellingham were both raised Catholic. Even his uncle, a man called Father Levi, was an ordained Catholic priest and Franciscan friar, who regularly listened to confession in church. As you would have expected, he looked every part the quintessential monk, for he would wear a long brown cassock with a mantle, a white cord around his waist, and a pair of leather sandals. I know it sounds crazy, but his humble appearance always reminded me fondly of Friar Tuck in the legendary stories of Robin Hood. Toby Bellingham's mother was Father Levi's younger sister Helen, who worked dutifully at the church for her brother as a secretary, which was why I spent so much time there with Toby, whiling away the long summer days on the church premises long after school hours. We would ride our bicycles along the green turf, playing all kinds of boyish games together, like cowboys and Indians, cops and robbers, while his mother, Mrs. Bellingham, spent a plethora of her time in devoted service to the church offices, usually sitting dutifully at a typewriter, tapping away furiously at the keyboard, or industriously filing away important stuff in one of the large metal filing cabinets, or even answering the telephone, which seemed to ring off the hook non-stop, causing Mrs. Bellingham a great deal of undue stress. She would grow panicky, dabbing her brow, exclaiming, oh dear, I do think my brother needs to hire a secretarial assistant to help me out. The work is just piling up." I met Father Levi several times as a young boy. He always came up to us to greet his nephew Toby, and was always terribly friendly towards me. I really liked him a lot. He looked like a good, godly man, who cared passionately about his flock. My parents were parishioners, so were naturally well acquainted with the priest, visiting him regularly for confession. My mother always believed going to confession was significant to help cleanse our impure hearts. She would always say that the human body was like a plumbing pipe, and unless it got cleaned out regularly with the spring water, which of course was God's grace, then the pipe would get badly clogged up with all kinds of unmentionables, building up into a filthy, murky sludge. I was to learn Father Levi had told my mother once that he always knew who was confessing to him on the other end of the screen, in the confession booth. So even though it was supposed to be kind of anonymous, invariably it clearly wasn't. He assured my mother it was challenging to sometimes live with the knowledge of other people's indiscretions, that you were the only one that was privy to, other than God himself. He believed that the main objective of confession was to reconcile people back to God. Even if the penitent were to confess to a grisly crime, as a priest, his discretion had to be maintained at all times. If it wasn't, the loyal seal would invariably be broken. He would say that God's grace was very different to a flawed judicial system. It is the heart of a man that is concerning to God, but not the method of punishment. God would far rather lavish the repentant heart with bountiful grace than any kind of earthly punishment. He claimed he couldn't listen to people's confessions too close to home, as the church teaches them not to minister to close friends and family. For he said, how could he be a son to his mother, as well as a spiritual adviser? It wouldn't work. It would be like mixing oil and water together. Besides, the last thing in the world he wanted was to listen to his mother's confessions. That I couldn't deal with, he would say. As a result, he would direct close family members to other ordained ministers that he was well acquainted with for the purposes of their confessions. I remember it was in the summer of 1982. It could have been the early spring. I can't exactly remember which. I was playing with my friend Toby in the front yard of the church. This quintessential charming little Catholic church building was situated outside Seattle, Washington, rather like a sparkling white jewel, nestled on the most perfectly manicured verdant lawns that were covered in a scattering of mature, very regal, stately-looking oaks, red maple, apple, plum and pear trees. An attractive arched awning, set between two white pillars, covered the white wooden church gate, which opened up onto two stone pathways, one leading directly to the church, while the other meandered through the vast viridescent grounds to the church's rear, that opened out into a sprawling graveyard. It was one of those graveyards with ancient gravestones that were so old that the name of some of the deceased people had been eroded by time, and all that was left on the stones were algae and lichen. Those were the graves that fascinated me the most, as they were so poetic in their arresting intrigue and aura of mystery that surrounded them, that spoke of bygone times when visitors to the church would have ridden on the back of a horse or carriage just to get there. There were times I'd place a few flowers from the churchyard, putting them around a nameless grave. I felt desperately sorry for the person whose name had been washed away by the hands of time, so that even the earth no longer remembered their names. For me, that was so terribly sad. I was told that some of those stones were over 300 years old. I could have well believed it. I loved playing in the graveyard with Toby, reading the name on the gravestones there. Death was a subject that intrigued and fascinated me, not in a macabre way, but I so often pondered, even at such a young age, what it would actually mean to die. As my mother would so often say, we are alive for such a short space of time, dead for an eternity. I loved the church gardens. Scattered liberally across the lawns were trellised benches with bright climber roses growing wildly around the arches. One of my favourite features in the churchyard was a huge glistening silver pond, covered with the waxy leaves of the water lilies, bespeckled with bright pinks and whites of lily flowers. I always appreciated sitting by this pond, watching the dragonflies darting over the water like tiny little buzzing aeroplanes with delicate opaque wings, whilst I enjoyed watching the frogs snapping up the occasional fly. The churchyards were pristinely maintained by a very fractious, ill-tempered and grumpy gardener, whom we secretly called Mr. Grumbles. Toby and I avoided him like the plague. He would churlishly moan at us tirelessly, as if we were a couple of blue-bottle flies he seriously wished he could swat. "You bloody kids," he would hiss at me. "You're ruining my turf, riding your bicycles over everything. Stick to the stone path, will you? Or better still, go and play indoors. Let that mother of yours, Toby, deal with your shenanigans, not me. I've got better things to do with my time than run after two willful brats." He also got mad at me when I picked flowers from the yard to pile on the unnamed graves, as there were beds strewn with ravishing pretty flowers, dappling the church with a kaleidoscope of bright colours, from flowering petunias, daylilies, evergreen candy tuft, coneflowers, marigolds, and brown-eyed Susans. "I like to keep the flowers in their beds where they belong, son, not carelessly dying around someone's gravestone. Churchyards are a sanctuary of respect. You boys are dishonouring the dead, tearing around the yard like a couple of little imbeciles." The church itself was built in the shape of a cross that faced Jerusalem. It was a lowly, humble white building with jewelled ornate arched stained glass windows in bright blazing colours, depicting ethereal pictures of Christ, along with symbolic proclamations of doves, crosses, pomegranates and vines. It had been getting quite hot out of doors. I think I was about 10 at the time. After another prickly heated session with the cantankerous gardener, who leered at us through pugnacious waspy brown eyes, "Would you mind keeping your hands and feet out of my flower beds? You bloody kids, squashing my precious seedlings!" We knew to avoid any further confrontations with him, so on this occasion we promptly decided to take our playing indoors. Where better than in the cool sanctuary of the church itself, that was always open. Parishioners would sometimes come traipsing into the church, usually in the morning, to light candles in remembrance for their dearly departed loved ones, or even settle down to pray in a pew. It was a hot day after all, so we decided to play under the large table, meant for the Eucharist for the blessing of the bread and wine. I think we were playing snakes and ladders together, under that large table swathed with a generous white tablecloth that covered us like some kind of makeshift tent. It really was a very appealing den for us. We brought along a plate of homemade sandwiches to enjoy, along with a couple of cans of cola. All of a sudden we could hear the sound of feet moving across the floor. We heard the screen door of the confession cubicle open and close behind itself, with a familiar squeaking sound. A second or so later we heard the clip-clop of women's shoes moving across the carpet. It sounded like she was having extreme difficulty walking in her high heels. Unfortunately, the cubicle was not terribly private for the persons sharing their confession against the screen door, as they were expected to sit in a chair directly outside the confession cubicle, which meant should anybody be close enough, they might actually hear the confession. Regretfully, we were close enough, far too close for comfort. Of course, we didn't realise at the time that we were going to have a bird's-eye view of the inside life of a Catholic priest, hearing confession along with the types of sins that weighed heavily upon the hearts of the people. I peeked out from under the white tablecloth. I could see a woman who was possibly in her 30s, with brown hair bending over in a submissive prayer position. I couldn't see her clearly. She was buckled over in her repentant stance. She appeared to be terribly upset. She was sniffing a lot, dabbing her eyes, occasionally blowing her nose quite violently into a tissue. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. My last confession was about 6 months ago." Toby and I could hear the woman's voice wobbling uneasily as she struggled to find the words that she was looking for. It was clear this confession lark was not easy by any manner of means. "I'm afraid, Father," she stammered, "there's no way to say this, but I'm becoming a compulsive, perpetual liar. It's hard to even admit this to myself, but regretfully, truly, I hardly recognise myself these days. I've always been a truthful person, Father. Even my mother said to me the other day that these days I'm lacking integrity, that I'm always making stuff up. She's absolutely right, of course." "Go on," came the father's voice. "Well, the lying, it's becoming so natural for me. It just rolls off my tongue, so smoothly like butter. I know it's bad, but I'm powerless to stop myself. I think it's my way of covering up my iniquities, Father. You see, I've been spending an exorbitant amount of money on things that we cannot really afford as a family. But I just can't resist buying them for myself. You know, designer clothes, shoes, fancy purses. My husband's completely clueless, Father, about how much I'm actually spending, how much I'm whittling away on extravagant, unnecessary stuff that I really don't need. You know, I see a thing in a shop, a designer purse, and I just have to buy it. I can't stop myself. The urgency, the compulsion to buy it is so strong. For a moment, it gives me a huge pleasure rush, like I imagine a person might get from drugs. I have so much stuff in my wardrobe, Father, that I haven't even touched. My wardrobe is literally bursting at the seams from all my shopping excursions. Do you know, Father, I've actually got 500 pairs of shoes, half that I've never even worn before. When my husband asks me how much these things cost, of course I lie to him. I tell him I got these things at bargain basement prices from the dollar store, when in reality they've broken the bank. Slowly but surely, we're sinking into the oblivion of debt. I'm scared, Pastor, about what my insatiable spending could do to my marriage." "He believes your story, that all your purchases cost you next to nothing?" "I think so, but it's beginning to backfire on me big time. You see, he's been asking me why we appear to be spending money like water these days, why everything is costing so much. So I lied to him. I told him that the money is all going on the cost of my daughter Gabriella's horseboarding, stabling and feeding costs. So naturally my husband thinks my daughter's horseboarding fees are excessive, when actually they're not very bad at all. He's now threatening to sell my daughter's horse. I feel absolutely terrible about this. It would break her heart, Father. I couldn't destroy her joy based on my inability to stop spending.
I see, came Father Levi's voice. It seems a lot of people are being hurt by your excessive lying and your insatiable appetite for spending lots of money. I imagine some of your stuff you purchased you've never touched. Am I right?
You're right. Some of them were still in their bags with labels attached and receipts still there.
Well, you do well to take them back to the store. Get your money back. Cut up all your credit cards.
Yes, Father.
What does the Bible say about greed? Does it not tell us to be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for a man's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions? Furthermore, you know the Lord despises lying lips, delights in people that are trustworthy. You don't need me to tell you that you don't need material things to make you happy. If that were the case, some of the richest people in the world would be among the happiest, the most fulfilled, the most enriched. But the reverse is always true. They're often among the most miserable people you can ever meet. For as King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, those who love money will never have enough of it. It seems that their hunger can never ever be satisfied. You need to ask the Lord for forgiveness, guidance, and for him to deliver you from your temptations.
Yes, Father.
I'm going to give you a penance to visit a sick person in hospital twice a week, to make them some homemade cookies, and I stress they must be made by you. Instead of spoiling yourself, you're going to be spoiling other people. With such actions, you will find a great inner reward. Your penance is for a month of hospital visits, along with 6 Hail Marys.
Yes, Father.
By the grace of the Lord, who sanctifies the repentant sinners, you are absolved from your sins.
Thank you, Father, said the woman, wiping her eyes with a tissue and scuttling out of the church rather like a frightened mouse. The next person that stepped forward for confession was a young man in his late 30s. Once again, I couldn't see him very clearly. He was cowering over in a submissive stance, so that all I could see was his crouched body, his full head of dark, buoyant curls, sprinkled with the occasional greys. Salt and pepper, my mother used to call that hair colour.
Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. My last confession was about 3 weeks ago. Father, I'm having problems with lust. We've hired a babysitter to mind our 2 kids. I can't get the bloody woman out of my mind. She's not even that pretty, but it's consuming me, Father. I seem to be terribly attracted to her. The worst part of it all is that she's been flirting with me shamelessly. It's hard to resist her advances. She's made it very clear she fancies me. She keeps giving me those seductive, suggestive looks. Is that so? What do you do when you're in a burning building? You get out of the fire. You get out of the fire. That's right. You need to get rid of this babysitter. Give her her calling cards. What does it say about lust in the Bible? It makes it clear that anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. But what do I tell the wife? If I tell her the babysitter needs to leave, she'll wonder what on earth is going on. You tell her you do not have a good feeling about this babysitter. You know that that is not a lie. You are telling her the truth. You don't have a good feeling about the babysitter because the feelings in your heart are not good. They're driven by sin. What does it say in Ecclesiastes? I find bitterer than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her grasp. The sinner will be the one that is ensnared. You know that God has given you a wife to alleviate you from all these temptations. It is a gift of God, a wife. Remove your mind from the gutter, lest you should become a gutter rat yourself. Remember, flee from all sexual immorality. For all sins a person commits are outside their body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Yes, Father. Your penance is unusual, but very pleasing to me. I want you to take your wife out every week for a date night for 6 months. You can go to the florist's right now to buy her a huge bouquet of flowers, and make it huge. Tell her you love her every day. You are required to give 7 Hail Marys. By the grace of God, who sanctifies all repentant sinners, you are absolved from your sins. Thank you, Father, said the man, giving a bow before ambling away from the confession cubicle. The next person to take his seat outside the confession booth was my own father. I could hardly believe it. It's my dad, I whispered to Toby. Oh, my goodness, it's my dad. Shh, said Toby. You don't want them to know we're here. Forgive me, Father. I have sinned, came my father's voice. I discerned it sound wobbly and unstable. I'd never heard his voice so shaky before. Father, I don't know what to say, nor do I know how to say it. I've done something very, very bad. Confession is never easy. Just get it off your chest. You know God is faithful to forgive a repentant sinner. I killed a man, Father. I watched in horror as my father clasped his hands in his hair, tugging it so hard. I was in no doubt he was hurting himself, almost like a self-induced punishment. How I wished the confession cubicle was tucked away in a quiet spot, far away from my ears that were now flapping like an elephant. There was a hushed silence that was so poignant you could have heard a pin dropped as a heaviness descended across the church. How did this happen? Tell me the whole story, so that I can comprehend everything fully. It happened on the weekend, Father. I was going hunting in the woods. It was a beautiful day. It wasn't long before I got the sense that I was being stalked. It was a very uneasy, unsettling feeling. I noticed the normally tranquil forest had become disturbingly muted, very quiet. Now, I've been hunting for many years, Father. I know those woods like the back of my hand, but never in my entire life have I known them to feel as voiceless as they did on this occasion. Even the birds' song was eclipsed by the stillness. It was a creeping, menacing feeling. As even the trees, it felt like they were watching me, almost as if there were eyes in their very leaves, in the bark of the tree trunks, in the lacy ferns, and even on the earthen floor. It felt as if everything was watching me. It was airy. Everything in my gut was telling me to get the hell out of the woods as fast as I possibly could. And that was when I saw the silhouette of a bear. Well, at first I thought it was a bear, moving through the trees. But this bear was exceptionally big, hefty, burly even. I could see the indistinguishable, hazy, blurry patches of black through the foliage of the trees. I soon realized that this was no bear, of course, for it let out the most discomposing, murderous scream that I've ever heard, Father. Bears don't scream like this. It was so high-pitched, ear-piercingly loud, with a terrifying resonance, so much so, Father, that even an ambulance siren would seem light on the ears by contrast. It put the fear of God into every fibre of my being. I promise you that even the Douglas fir trees began to visibly shake under the immense vibration of this thing. It thrashed the tree branches violently, with such a potent, puissant force. I could hear them cracking, snapping, breaking. I've never felt so much fear, Father. Never. In that second I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that my life was in perilous danger. My heart began to thunder in my chest violently. I could hear every booming beat. My hands became clammy. I was sweating like a pig. And I'm not inclined to sweat at all, Father, but on this occasion my camouflaged green and beige cotton shirt was literally saturated, as if I'd been swimming out in the lake. Then this thing, this god-awful thing, came charging after me, moving on its tree-trunk-sized legs, pounding the ground so forcefully with every lunging step. It was like thump, thump, thump. Father, my whole body was trembling. I was rattling like a wine glass on a sideboard. I tried to run, believe me I did, but I couldn't. I think even my adrenaline response was completely paralyzed by this all-consuming terror. You know, Father, I have a cat at home who brings a live, trembling mouse over to his dinner bowl quite regularly. He'll eat his kibble with the live mouse still in his bowl, which he chooses to consume later. I used to say to my wife, why the hell does the mouse not get the heck out of that bowl and just flee? Now I know, Father, exactly why. Terror. That's what terror does to you. I was like that little mouse in the cat bowl, waiting for this predatory critter to devour me, to eat me whole. I promise you my body was like an ancient rusty farm tractor left to rot away in a field for years with a dead engine that simply couldn't start. Even though every part of my brain was telling me to run, those signals were not cooperating with my legs. So there is something seriously flawed in the adrenaline response, let me tell you, Father. All I could do was to shoot the creature. I couldn't aim at him precisely. My jiggling hands were shaking and just trembling too much. Besides, I was disorientated, unable to focus properly. But I did manage to pull the trigger backwards, fire some random shots in the air, hoping that the noise would scare this monstrous beast away, whatever in God's name it actually was. I must have hit pay dirt, because the creature went tumbling, crashing, falling flat on its back, completely dead. Everything became still, very quiet for a moment. All I could hear was my own breath. Finally, I was able to come around from my benumbed state, which was like coming around from an anesthetic after a huge operation. I felt dazed, confused, jumbled up inside. Truly, it felt as if my brain was completely scrambled. I ambled over to the creature to see what I had actually shot. Oh, Father, it was a man. I had killed a man. I don't know what to say, Father. I'd killed a man. Father Levi didn't say anything for a moment. Father, say something, please. You had killed a man. What did he look like? Like a regular man, Father. Granted, he was different to us, but he was definitely a man. The face on this thing was human. The best way I can describe him is being like a wild man, for instead of clothes, his body was obviously covered in long, flowing, dark hair, which was absent on the face and on the soles of the feet and on the underside of his hands and fingers. He was very big, Father. Actually, big is an understatement. He was Herculean in size. I would describe him as having a solid, dense build, rather like a rhino or an elephant, substantial like that. I was surprised he'd been killed so easily. He almost looked bulletproof. He was that solid. I think I would estimate him to be over 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, 3 foot wide. Well, on the shoulder area, that is. The only way I can describe the face to you is it reminded me of a Cherokee Indian. You know, the high cheekbones, the hooded, deep-set dark eyes, the masculine jawline. Oh, I could see that I'd hit the creature in the head. I could see the blood oozing out of the bullet wound. Father, I felt so dreadful. I began to sob. And I've never been a man who is partial to crying. I don't cry easily. But the gravity of what I had done weighed down so heavily on my heart. I mean, he may not have been a regular human being, sporting human clothes or a job at Walmart, but he was human nevertheless. So moments later, caught up in the sticky spider web of my thoughts, I looked up to see a dark creature standing beside me. I think it must have been the wild man's partner, because she collapsed on the ground next to him. She began to howl and lament like you and I would if we lost someone we dearly loved. The poor wild woman was inconsolable with grief. She was trying to shake the wild man's body awake, but he lay there deceased. She looked up at me. It was like her words penetrated my mind, Father. Why did you do this? He would never have hurt you. He wanted you to leave us alone. These woods belong to us. You were trespassing on our abode. Father, I know I wasn't imagining things, but this female wild woman was speaking to me. I know she was, but it was in my mind, but I could hear the female voice. It was like telepathic communication. I'm sorry, I said to her. It was an accident. I didn't mean to do it. I remember her eyes burnt into mine. You've killed my best friend in the world. She then pulled him by the legs, dragged him along the ground, until they were gone from my sight. Oh, Father, my heart, it just broke. If you've ever heard of a broken heart, Father, I've experienced it. My father began to sob. The tears poured down his cheeks. I'd never seen him so vulnerable before. He was utterly devastated. Father, what am I to do? He wailed. I killed a man. I cannot forgive myself for this evil. Your story is indeed very unusual, but your conscience is pierced. So the fact that you perceive this thing you encountered to be human means that more than likely that he was. The conscience is designed by God to sharpen your understanding between right and wrong. Yet it was clearly not human in regards to the law of our land. However, in your heart you feel like you have killed a man. I do not believe for a moment that an accidental death is murder. There was a moment when you were fearing for your life. You felt certain that this thing would kill you. At the time, you had no idea what it was. Even if you were wrong in your perception, you fired random shots, one that invariably ended up killing him. It's a tragedy, of course, but it was still an accident. But, Father, what should I do? What penance have you for me? I think that you've given that to yourself. The burden of your pain is more than enough penance than to lay any more at your door. I think you need to start by forgiving yourself. You need to seek the Lord for his loving grace, guidance and help in regards to this matter. You might consider going back into those woods with a basket of goodies for the poor wild woman, as your way of making amends. It would be a very nice thing for you to do. Buy her some fruit and nuts, stuff like that for her. Thank you, Father. That's a very good idea. I will do that. By the grace of God, who sanctifies repentant sinners, you are absolved from your sins. Thank you, Father, said my father. As you can imagine, after hearing my father's confession in church and subsequently returning home to find my mother unduly distressed, for she had sensed something was terribly wrong with my doleful, dejected dad over the entire week, whose behaviour had become unfathomable. The normally fun-loving man with the easy-going disposition was like a shadow of his former self. His gloomy, anguished face aligned with hopeless despair, a despair that she'd never witnessed before. She knew something was demoralizing his forlorn heart, for he had retracted into his shell like a tortoise, barely touched his food, while his woeful sorrowfulness filled the house with a nauseating melancholia. She did try to talk to him about what was irking him, but he shut down, never saying a word. It was then that I told my mother what I'd hearkened in the church. I now realized it wasn't an accident that I'd overheard that confession, for I'm in no doubt I was meant to hear it. God wanted me to hear it. My father admitted years later that the torture over what had happened to the wild man would have quite literally killed him. Fortunately, my mother, having been let in on the secret, was able to bring my father the peace and closure he was so desperately seeking. My mother was able to contact an indigenous Indian who knew all about the wild people of the wood, called Sasquatch or Bigfoot. His name was Moitoi, which means rainmaker. It is often believed that a rainmaker is an intermediary with the natural world and the Almighty himself, symbolically being able to assist in the washing away of sins through the grace of God. I was to learn that Moitoi had taken my father to the woods, where my father had accidentally killed the wild man, as he informed him that they needed to perform the ceremony on exactly the same spot where the creature had breathed his last, for even the earth may have absorbed some of his blood, as the blood, he informed my dad,
was the very life of a man.
"You need to make your peace with the wild man," he told my father. "Receive the absolution you received from the priest from them. We need to call upon the spirit of Sasquatch."
I'm not sure exactly what Moitoi actually did, but my father informed me that he pounded a drum made from animal skin, played the flute, shook the rattle, all the while chanting some Indian songs in the southern Iroquoian language. I gather Moitoi burnt some sweet-smelling aromatic incense, performed some ancient chants, while my father left a massive basket of fruits and nuts on the very spot where the body had lain. This was a gifting to the female Bigfoot, which was something he continued to do every year on the eve of the accident. Once the ceremony had been completed, my father reluctantly informed Moitoi that his heart still felt heavy.
"But of course it's not over yet," said Moitoi. "You haven't received absolution, but you will know when you've received it. I know your repentant heart will be greatly appreciated by the Sasquatch people. Undoubtedly, you will hear from them shortly."
"How soon?" asked my father.
"The wild man should visit you. It won't be long now. His spirit has definitely heard your call, for I picked up that impression on the wind. 'I will leave you,' he said, with the words of Blackfoot. 'What is life? It is the flash of a firefly, the breath of a buffalo in the winter-time. It is like the shadow that runs across the grass, loses itself in the sunset.' At that, he was gone. Shortly after Moitoi had left, the rain poured down onto our terracotta roof, while jagged electric yellow lightning flashes thrashed across the sky like vertical firework displays, while the earth groaned and rumbled as the thunder boomed. Could it be that Moitoi had brought out the rain? Could it be that my father's repentant heart had been forgiven by the Sasquatch people? I certainly hope so. About 2 days after the ceremony in the woods, I awoke to find my father singing to himself in the kitchen. He was preparing blueberry pancakes for our breakfast. He looked as if the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. My father had not been in a happy mood like this for a long time, so my mother and I gave each other astonished glances, for my father was like a new man. His eyes twinkled and gleamed. He even whistled happily to himself as he flipped the pancakes. "Why are you so happy?" my mother asked, clasping her arms around my father lovingly, holding him tenderly close, a tear splashing over her cheek. "For a moment I thought I'd lost my husband. It's nice to have you back again." "I'm very happy, sweetheart, because I received absolution from the wild man last night, the one that I killed in the woods." "What?" said my mother. "The Bigfoot I killed appeared to me in my dreams last night. Only this was much more real than a dream. He looked at me with the most beautiful, loving, kind eyes. He told me that all was forgiven, that he was very happy where he was. He told me he would rest far better if I would forgive myself. He told me that his female partner would be sending me a gift to express her forgiveness towards me. Naturally, my mother and I didn't know what to make of my father's strange announcement, but as long as he was happy, that was all that mattered to us. It was a week later when we found a necklace of eagle's feathers on our doorstep. I'm glad to tell you that after the absolution, not only from a Catholic priest, but from the wild people of the woods, I got my loving father back, because once he had been forgiven, only then could he forgive himself. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it was the only way I could manage to survive. I was young, naive, vulnerable, exceedingly ignorant at the time. About 15 years old, violated, molested, abused by my foster father. My real parents handed me over to social services when I was born, as both of them were homeless dropouts, hopelessly addicted to narcotics, unable to take care of me, let alone even themselves, for their obnoxious, all-consuming, pervasive addiction had drained and guzzled their dreams faster than the tap water gushing down a plug hole. From thenceforth it would seem I was carted away from one desolate, sullen and cheerless foster home to another. Most of these loveless homes offered me little to no support, were only fostering to line their pockets still further with more money, not out of the gracious, generous goodness of their hearts. I ran away from my final foster home in Portsmouth, which is an independent city in Virginia southwest,
across the Elizabeth River from Norfolk. I absconded due to my obnoxious foster father, who had a fixation for underage girls. I knew that I couldn't face another day of his horrendous, unflagging abuse. Of course I told my foster mother what he was doing to me, but she didn't believe a word of it. "My husband would never do that," she insisted. "You're a nasty little liar, that's what you are." I knew by the conjecture on her face that she was fully aware of her husband's nightly visitations to my bedroom, that he conducted with a bold, obscene confidence that left me in no doubt that he had done this many times before, with other foster kids staying at his home. So it was a no-brainer for me to run away. Of course I was absolutely terrified. I did feel fragile, endangered, afraid, certainly about what the future held for me. But surely anything had to be better than living in an unconvivial, hostile environment with two people who treated me so impassively with a callous apathy. My story was not unlike the other impoverished, disadvantaged girls on my watch, who had fallen out of luck, ending up in prostitution, or with similar unfortunate accounts to tell of hard, punishing lives racked by sexual abuse, crippled by low self-esteem, driven by feelings of inferiority, inspired by desperation. It was a given that, much like myself, many of the working girls were lacking the quintessential employment skills that they would invariably need to acquire agreeable jobs in the workplace. Indeed, being underage certainly was a hazard, a stumbling block if you like, which meant doors of opportunity were slammed violently in your face. Most of the homeless girls, driven by financial necessity, drifted into this insidious, deceptive, guileful lifestyle like a piece of lumber floating in the water, drifting to wherever the current would take them. It was almost certainly like that for us, if we were desirous to survive, as the survival instinct tends to kick in very hard when you're struggling to stay afloat, and not to be throttled and consumed by the tsunami of challenges life can unleash upon you. For it was clear all choices or opportunities to advance ourselves in a positive way were permanently expunged from us. There was no knight in shining armour that would come to rescue us. We had to rescue ourselves, or we would never make it on the cruel, cold streets out there. Unfortunately, I ended up addicted to crack cocaine, like so many other young girls like myself. We were encouraged to take it by our clients and pimps alike. The big trouble with a drug like crack cocaine is that after trying it only once, you're ensnared. Much like a beaver caught in a trap, you can't escape its cunning allure. It meant that prostitution literally moored us like a boat docked in the marina so that we couldn't escape. Our addiction to drugs became a vicious cycle, as we needed to support a desperate habit that required incessant feeding like a hungry shark, or then you would have serious unpleasant side effects. While I was on the crack cocaine, I felt as if I could conquer the world, which meant the insecurity inside me was somewhat suppressed. My oppressive, dysfunctional lifestyle became much more tolerable as I looked forward to the next high. Pretty much lived for it, actually, which meant I was completely enslaved by its powerful hold over my life. When I first arrived in Portland, a kind man, well, seemingly kind at the time, enticed me into his life like a fish at the end of a line. I was unsuspecting, naive, very, very gullible. The man was a pimp who lured me into his home under false pretenses to ensnare me, as that's how they tend to operate. Slowly but surely I ended up on the street corner, selling my body in the age-old profession in Portland. It would seem that prostitution was first birthed in Burnside Street in the 1800s. Old Town was the area where prostitutes walked the streets, known as Whitechapel, named after London's waterfront, where Jack the Ripper began murdering prostitutes. It was a haven for brothels, gambling houses, saloons. Today it is still this part of Portland that is a pivotal spot for picking up girls of the night. I remember being whisked onto the streets by a pimp who took me under his charge, along with a few others. We would walk up the streets wearing short skirts, fishnet stockings, high-heeled shoes. People think prostitutes all have to look a certain way, but the truth is remarkably different, as size is never significant. It seems every man has his type, some who like the full, rounded figure, some like women to be obese, others like slimmer women, some athletic, boyish types. There's no cookie-cutter type, as most people wrongly assume. Then there are men who prefer women of colour, or Oriental woman, while others like a regular-looking American white girl. Some like variety. It all depends, as the saying goes, beauty is most definitely in the eye of the beholder. There are no hard and fast rules in this regard. And I know it sounds gross to talk about women like this, but this is the way it was in my industry. I did discern in those days that most of the punters would be very careful to choose women who they thought were less likely to rob them. Young girls were notorious for robbing their clients so that they could cut down on their street work significantly, as believe me, there is no pleasure in selling your body. I've heard that there are people that enjoy the lifestyle, but in my 15 years' experience of working the streets, I never met anyone who derived even an iota of pleasure from their job. If they told you they enjoyed it, it was probably a big fat lie, a guarded secret that only the insiders knew. You see, there's a lot of play acting involved in prostitution. You have to pretend you're happy, that you're enjoying yourself. Otherwise, if you're all miserable, your client will go somewhere else. No one wants to hook up with someone who has a hangdog expression on their face that says, "I'm miserable. I hate being here. I don't want to be here." Anything for sale needs to be appealing, otherwise no one's going to bite the bait or purchase the product. Like anything else in life, it has to come with some form of attraction. I do remember being a prostitute was the most demeaning job in the entire world. It increased my sense of self-loathing exponentially. I felt unclean, dirty, contaminated all the time. Then there was always that dreadful fear of developing a sexually transmitted disease that hung over my life like a looming dark thundercloud. I was terrified of this, but lucky that I had a streetwise pimp that was stringent about what we could and couldn't do with our clients, most of whom were blue-collar workers, working 9 to 5 during the week and on the weekends. Then they would hook up with prostitutes at cheap motels. My pimp wisely knew that if we ended up with a sexually transmitted disease, we would be as good for work as a stringy, dried-up old chicken trussed up and hanging up on a rotisserie hook in Chinatown. So he had a tough set of rules that needed to be adhered to at all times. Others weren't so lucky, as their pimps were so desperate for big bucks and big bucks quickly, that they didn't see the bigger picture, which meant girls were riddled with STDs, herpes, gonorrhea, HIV, you name it. And like old cars that ended up on the scrap heap, they became unable to work. In truth, after about 5 years of work, the average prostitute is pretty much burned out. It's a tough, gruesome life, and most certainly not for the faint-hearted. It was not long before I moved into a small apartment in Portland, which I shared with 3 other working girls, who became like sisters to me. Sadly, 2 of those girls are no longer alive today. Unfortunately, the cocaine addiction meant that those of us wishing to leave the profession knew that it was unlikely to ever happen, as our need for drugs consumed our lives. It literally was like Kool-Aid for us, an escape from the reality of what we were doing to ourselves. For let's not kid, prostitution can eat away at your soul like a weevil in a box of cereal. It is soul-destroying. Don't let anyone kid you otherwise. As a working girl, I did have my regulars. I preferred them over and above the unpredictable, arbitrary stranger. I knew what they required, their habits, their likes and dislikes. I was familiar, comfortable, and acquainted with their ways. For believe me, there were women who were beaten up, abused, even killed by strangers. It was a dark, egregious, unsavoury world, of which prostitutes' life held so little value for many. And many crimes against prostitutes had surreptitiously been covered and buried up, like a squirrel's stash of acorns for the winter. I had one woeful customer who booked my services to talk. We do get customers like that. I like those. I felt so sorry for him. He told me that after his wife had died 10 years prior, he had become desperately lonely. He was shocked by how young I was, disgusted by the immoral, depraved men exploiting me, reminding me tirelessly that if they were intimate with me physically, they were committing statutory rape. Well, that was in the early days when I first started the prostitution before I got older. He picked me up to chat. He would take me to an ice cream parlour, treat me to milkshakes and waffles. He loved watching me eat. He would talk to me about his dead wife Agnes, and reminisce over the magical times that they'd spent together. I would hug him, hold his hand and talk. That was all he wanted from me. He would tell me some weekends were so incredibly lonely he wouldn't even talk to a single soul. I remember he gave me a gold chain with an opal pendant on it that had belonged to his wife. He said his wife would want me to have it because I'd saved his life. I still have it today. I wore it all the time, pretending it was fake so no one would steal it from me. I could never sell it, as it was so sentimental to me. I enjoyed talking to him. He was such a lovely man. I did have a few clients who were unhappily married, some staying in the relationships due to children, finances, religion, convenience, and all other kinds of reasons. Then those that were happily married but weren't feeling satisfied in the bedroom department or were looking for some excitement outside of their own marriage. Then there were the awful customers, men depraved, disreputable, degenerate, warped, seriously sick in the head, that we would avoid like the plague when we recognised their trucks or spotted them window shopping down the street, looking for a woman they could abuse, beat up and physically hurt. One day as I was standing on the street corner, desperately waiting for a punter to stop his truck to employ my services, for some reason the last couple of days had been very bad, with poor working opportunities. I was very desperate. I needed to procure some more cocaine. It was getting cold. I was beginning to shiver as blasts of cold air punnelled my body with a burning chill. It was late autumn, veering towards early winter, which isn't good news for a prostitute that wants to keep warm. I remember I was trembling with cold. I was wearing a skimpy short red tartan skirt, flimsy black top that came up to my belly button, a pair of knee-high black shiny plastic boots. I breathed a sigh of relief as my punter stopped his white truck, wound down the window, looking me up and down, and then asked me how much. Before I could even answer his question, he said, "Get in," in a raspy, deep voice. We hadn't even negotiated anything by then. But I still opened the passenger truck door, climbing into the seat beside him, nearly feeling more than a little hesitant, while the man pushed down the pedal of his accelerator and raced through the bright streets of Portland at one hell of a speed. I studied him curiously. Something about him was so nefarious it made me shudder. It gave me chills. He was large, a heavy-set man, wearing a white vest that revealed his powerful biceps that were heavily tattooed. He wore a thick gold chain around his neck, an expensive-looking watch on his wrist. I noticed he had a revolver on the dashboard. I do remember he was possibly in his 50s, with a scattering of brown hair on his head, very intense brown eyes that gave me the creeps. They were hostile, unkind, and downright mean. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Never you mind," he said. "You'll see when we get there." The slippery tone of his voice was very brutal, hard, devoid of any kindness. My heart sank like a heavy stone slipping to the bottom of a murky lake. I instinctively knew I shouldn't have got into the truck, as his intentions towards me were iniquitous, villainous, infernal. I sensed that instinctively within my gut. Warning bells began to ring in my head like blaring home alarm systems going off in the night. Part of me was screaming, "Get out of the truck! Get out of the truck now!" But he had switched on the internal locking system, so it was too late to hurriedly make my escape. I was trapped. "What's your name?" he barked. "Kylie," I said. "Kylie? I suppose it suits you. A good name for a tart." "I may be a prostitute, but I still have feelings, you know. You should treat me with some respect. You're incredibly rude." "Respect?" he said, spitting onto the windscreen. "Respect? You lost that kiddo when you started selling your body to all and sundry. You don't know the meaning of respect. You know nothing. You're like a cockroach." "Look," I said, "I don't think this is going to work out for both of us. I'd like to end the transaction now." "Would you?" "I think you'll find that when you got into my truck, you authorised this transaction." I said nothing, knowing full well if I challenged this perverse, unethical man, he might get rather violent with me. It certainly wasn't worth the risk. I'd seen too many prostitutes with black eyes, bludgeoned faces, broken teeth, bruised bodies, and that's if you were lucky. I realised the car had driven out of Portland. We were in the countryside, travelling down a remote country road, fringed by red maples and white oak trees on either side of the embankment, without a solitary soul in sight. "Why are you taking me into the countryside? Where are you taking me? I work in Portland, not in the countryside." "You're about to fulfil my fantasy. That's why I hired you. Isn't that what a prostitute does? Create fantasies for their clients?" I felt sick to the stomach. As whatever he wanted from me, it wasn't good. I suspected he'd beat me up, leave me with a black eye. I could sense I was in for a rough night. I began to emotionally prepare myself for being beaten up by this thuggish oaf. The truck pulled over to this rough dirt-lined clearing strewn with pebbles. The man pulled up the handbrake into park, pointing his revolver directly at me, yelling at me, "Get out! Get out of my truck!" "What are you going to do with me? You're not going to harm me, are you? Please, please," I begged. "Please don't hurt me." The man pushed me ahead of him. "Move," he said. "Move." It was a very dark night, but he had come prepared. He put a torch on his head and on mine, so that I could also see clearly. I remember we were walking into the heart of the woods, where tall trees towered up into the night sky. Their dense, dark, vertical forms seemed so menacing on this night, as they jiggled and swayed in the wind. I was relieved to see that there were walking trails, so I was tottering around in my knee-high boots that were certainly not designed to walk in precipitous, rugged places like this that were potentially rather treacherous. So I was tripping awkwardly while he kept shouting obscenities at me, calling me reprehensible names that I dare not repeat. I had no idea where we were. I remember it was deathly quiet. The stillness of the forest tormented me. It didn't feel natural. There were no chirping crickets, nor were there any croaking frogs. It was so quiet. All I could hear was the crunch of my own boots, as my soles squished the crunchy autumn leaves beneath my feet. The forest floor was just covered with dry, crunchy leaves from the oak trees, like a resplendent sea of gold. It was thanks to the open spaces between the boughs of the trees that gentle streams of moonlight flooded the forest floor, offering a measly measure of comfort, but not very much. My heart was racing at 100 miles an hour. I could feel it thumping in my chest like a booming drum. I could taste the bitter taste of nausea consuming the back of my throat, almost as if I was drinking an unripe grapefruit juice, only this was nasty. I knew the man was pointing a rifle behind my back as I stumbled ever forwards into the woods. Should I attempt running away? Would he shoot me, I wondered. Somehow I suspected he would, so I decided that the best course of action was to oblige his every need. Then maybe he would leave me alone. With luck I would emerge from this event unscathed, but all the more wiser. Before long we arrived at an open space in the woods, where a couple of fallen logs were laid out like a makeshift bed. The man commanded me to sit down. Then he pulled out a walkie-talkie speaker out of his pocket. I heard him say, "Are you there, Dirk? Happy birthday, dude. Good, I've got her. Are you ready for a good time? Yes, she's a looker, but trashy looking. Young, just like you like them. Yes, innocent looking. Naive." "Who's that?" I asked, looking alarmed. "Who you talking to?" "You're a birthday present," said the man, leering at me. "I'm going to sit back and watch while my friend takes great pleasure in beating you up to a pulp, finishing you off, burying you beneath the forest floor, until all those leaves are covering you completely," he said, smiling at me maliciously. I knew I had absolutely nothing to lose, so I attempted to run away as fast as I could, but the man quickly pulled out his revolver and shot me directly in the ankle. I could feel a warm, hot heat pulsate through my left boot, launching into my ankle like a steel missile. The pain was excruciating. I writhed in agony. I do not recall a time of greater pain than this. I screamed out in distress. My screams morphed into wails that were carried on the wind like a high-pitched emergency siren. "That's better," said the man. "I think you're nicely immobilized. You shan't be able to run away." Then I saw another man moving towards me through the woods, with an odious smile on his face. He leered at me approvingly. "Now she's a tasty morsel. She'll do nicely," he said, giving me the once-over with a soulless pair of dark eyes. He then gave his friend an approving high five. By this stage I seriously wanted to throw up, vomit, be violently sick. I might have been a prostitute, but I hadn't asked for any of this. But when working in such a spiritually impoverished profession like mine, you're rarely exposed to the real dredges of society, the gutter rats that run down the sewers, using the shadows of darkness to keep their treacherous deeds at bay. It is these kinds of people few get to see, but they are out there, looming in the dark corners, their minds buzzing with iniquitous fantasies that would make the vast majority of us feel completely revolted. But as a prostitute, I had seen the unforgiving brutality of this heinous profession. I was still screaming at the two men at the top of my lungs to let me go. I didn't want any part of this. This isn't what I'd signed up for. The man began to undress, the one that had been given me as his birthday present, so to speak, piling his clothes into a neat pile, taking care to fold them up very neatly. The next thing I knew was that the forest began to boom. Something thundered through the forest at an alarming speed. Whatever it was, it picked up momentum like a boisterous wind, but the vibration of the footfall was so substantial that the only way I can describe it was something hefty was moving towards us. You just knew that instantly. It was big, portentous, dangerous, lethal, threatening, as its movements were like an unwritten signature that left you in no doubt that something quite dreadful was about to unfold. It was in those moments it was like time stood still, clasping back valuable seconds with a fervent hunger. It was like everything else beyond the booms and the vibrations was almost suspended like beads and globules of jelly, momentarily disabling one's ability to react. It was like we were all gripped in what I can only describe as a stunned stupor that disorientates, immobilizes, paralyzes you. One of the men said, "Brady, what the heck is that?" The expression on their faces was one of unadulterated, consummate terror. Then we saw her. She fixed her all-knowing, sagacious, deep-set dark eyes on both men, with an infinite, astute, discerning look, as if she was in no doubt what was going on. The formidable, anomalous creature looked like a wild woman, only in massive proportions, built like a giant, in width, girth, and weight, towering at easily 8 foot tall, with shoulders as wide as a front door. I noticed her legs were long, lean, and muscular. Her overlong arms trailed beyond her knees. She was covered from head to toe with long flowing hair, of a very pale auburn hue, like a pretty strawberry blonde colour. The leathery skin on her face was a tawny salmon brown. I knew she was female, for she possessed 2 very small pert breasts. She was the most intimidating, terrifying creature that I've ever beheld. She was angry, very angry. Her deep dark eyes raged like burning coals of fire. Her face was incredibly human. She pulled back her lips and began to roar. The man called Dirk was blocking his ears. The sound was ear-piercingly loud. He tried desperately to run. The other one who had picked me up, called Brady, was now reaching for his revolver. The creature's keen, fast eyes travelled swiftly to his gun like a tiny plane landing on an airstrip with remarkable precision. She grabbed the revolver from him unhesitantly, with a swiftness faster than the speed of our thoughts, and threw it somewhere in the underbrush, lunging towards Brady with a powerful stride. She seized Brady with such a brute force. I've never seen anything like it. He looked tiny, fragile, pathetic, rather like a fragile Ken doll. He was screaming as she picked him up in her hands, throwing him towards the tree, where he hit the hefty trunk like a wall of cement. He groaned in agony as he fell backwards to the ground with a laborious thud. She then moved towards him, twisting his neck, so that now his glazed, empty eyes were staring at me back to front. The other man was screaming as he struggled to get away. "No! No! No!" He was almost begging the creature to stop, not to hurt him. But compassion she showed him not. She grappled the man easily, as if she was picking apples off a tree. And this man, let me tell you, was by no means small. She snapped his neck, twisting it around back to front like a cork in a wine bottle. The 2 men were now lying there deceased. I didn't care at all. She trotted over to me with such a loving look in her eyes that I knew her intentions towards me were kind. She had heard my screams and protectively come to my rescue. She gently touched my head, looking at me in my eyes like a protective mother. I began to sob and sob. She reached over to rock me in her arms, cradling the back of my neck and cupping my head in her chest. It was funny, she smelt so nice, reminding me of petrichor, how the earth smells after the rain. I kept saying, "Thank you, thank you. You saved my life." I believe she understood what I was saying. The creature soon realized that I couldn't walk, as I tried to raise myself on the ground but began to whimper in agony as I hobbled all over the place. I could see she was thinking as she scratched her head in deep contemplation, looking at me as if wondering how she could possibly help me. Then she picked me up in her arms after having made a decisive decision and carried me through the woods. I knew that to her I was as light as a feather. She did not struggle as she moved through those woods speedily, never jolting or staggering for a single moment. For if she had done so, the insufferable pain would have been intolerable, as my ankle was throbbing wildly. It was a dark, insipid, soundless night, but I wasn't remotely afraid. I knew I could trust this wild woman with my life. She was intelligent, discerning, incredibly gentle. I remember she glided with me so graciously through the woods. The ride was smooth. It seemed like we were floating on air at times, despite the fact that she did climb up some rugged terrain, through some sagebrush, into a meadow with cows that upon seeing us made a mooing commotion, hurriedly trotting away to the edge of the field. They were clearly intimidated by her, but despite their angst, they watched us curiously while chewing their cud as we ambled through the field. Before long, in the dark shadows, I saw the silhouette of a farmhouse with one outside light still left on. The creature lowered me to the ground outside the farmer's front door, indicating for me to get help. I thanked her as I watched her gliding away into the trees. My heart was filled with awe and wonder, for I knew beyond question she had saved my life. The door was opened by a very kindly-looking man with a full head of grey hair, wearing blue and white pinstripe pyjamas. He looked startled to find me at his front door, very concerned. I explained I'd been shot in the ankle, so he immediately called for the ambulance, looking rather bewildered that I'd managed to arrive at his front doorstep on a gammy leg like that. I was also beginning to sweat profusely and shake, as I was desirous for some crack cocaine, but I received help at the hospital while undergoing an operation to remove the bullet and to repair my shattered ankle. While I was in hospital, I was referred to a place where I could receive treatment for my crack addiction. I'm so lucky because I came off the drugs seamlessly compared to other less fortunate people than myself. Even my therapist was amazed, describing me as one of their quickest breakthroughs that she'd ever seen. I never returned to my life of prostitution, nor the crack cocaine, as the centre where I was rehabilitated from found me a job, which morphed into my being promoted in the company from a very mediocre position into a sales executive, so I never ever looked back. The two men's bodies were recovered from the woods. I heard about it on the radio. The death was described as bizarre and macabre. I still believe those men intended to kill me after they'd beaten me up. I have no doubt about that in my mind. I was to learn that both of those men were ex-convicts, so I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by their atrocious, contemptible treatment towards me. When I met the man I was to marry on a camping holiday with one of my work friends, I came clean to him about my life of prostitution. It hit him hard like a brick to the face. He didn't take it at all well. It made him angry and enraged. He eventually came around to accepting that part of my life, where I had made a living selling my body, but it did torment him for a long time. Please don't judge people too harshly for some of the decisions they choose to make in life in order to survive. It can be a tough, hard world out there, with many people like myself, lost souls down on their luck, falling victim to this insidious dark world. I have so much compassion for anyone caught up in this lifestyle, for it is rare to find anyone who enjoys what they do. I am appreciative for an anonymous forum like this on which I can share my story. I want to tell you that the creature that saved my life was definitely a Bigfoot. It was easy for her to kill those two men, but I promise you she knew exactly what she was doing. It was like she could see into the depths of their heart and sense that they were very bad men. The world is a much better place without them, I assure you. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.